Episode 1: Ancient Echoes, Music in Mesopotamia and Egypt. Part 1. Welcome to the Slumbering Musicologist. I'm delighted you've joined me for this first journey into the distant past, where we'll explore the earliest sounds of human musical expression. Tonight, we travel back thousands of years to the river valleys of Mesopotamia and Egypt, where civilization itself was born, and with it, the first music we can begin to understand. This is a podcast designed for rest, for reflection, for those quiet hours when your mind seeks gentle occupation. As we wander through ancient temples and royal courts, through the daily lives of people who lived 4,000 years ago, let your thoughts drift where they will. There's no test at the end, no need to remember every detail. Simply allow the story of humanity's earliest music to wash over you like a slow, meandering river. The journey we're embarking upon tonight is both scholarly and imaginative. We'll ground ourselves in archaeological evidence, actual clay tablets inscribed with hymns, tomb paintings showing musicians at work, physical instruments pulled from the earth after millennia. But we'll also need to use our imagination, because so much has been lost. The sounds themselves have vanished into silence. What remains are fragments, tantalizing clues that require careful interpretation and, yes, informed speculation. What we'll discover together in the next few hours is nothing less than the birth of music as a conscious, cultivated art. We'll meet the world's first known composer, a priestess whose name has echoed across 43 centuries. We'll explore how music served the gods in temple rituals, how it entertained pharaohs, and how ordinary people sang as they worked the fertile fields along the Tigris, Euphrates, and Nile. We'll examine the instruments they played, consider the scales and rhythms they might have used, and reflect on what music meant to them. This first episode sets the foundation for everything that follows. The musical traditions we'll explore in future weeks, from medieval chant to Baroque concertos, from romantic symphonies to modern innovations, all trace their ancestry back to these ancient river valleys. Understanding where music began helps us understand where it's going and why it matters so deeply to human experience. If you find these journeys through music history helpful for rest, I'd be grateful if you'd subscribe to the Slumbering Musicologist. New episodes arrive every Friday at 6 p.m. Greenwich Mean Time, each one a gentle exploration of a different corner of musical history. You can leave the video playing as you drift off. That's exactly what it's designed for. There are no sudden loud sounds, no jarring transitions, just a steady, peaceful exploration of how humanity has made music across the centuries. To understand the music of ancient Mesopotamia and Egypt, we must first understand the worlds that created it. We're speaking of a time so distant that it challenges imagination, a period beginning around 3000 before the Common Era and extending to roughly 500 before the Common Era, a span of 25 centuries. To put this in perspective, the entire history from ancient Rome to the present day is shorter than the period we're exploring tonight. Mesopotamia, the land between the rivers, occupied the fertile valley between the Tigris and Euphrates in what we now call Iraq. The name itself comes from Greek words meaning between rivers, though the people who lived there called it by various names. The Sumerians, the earliest civilization we can clearly identify, simply called it the land or referred to specific city-states. Here arose humanity's first cities: Uruk, Ur, Babylon, Nineveh. These weren't small settlements but true urban centers, some housing tens of thousands of people. Uruk, at its height around 2800 before the Common Era, may have had a population of 50,000 or more, making it by far the largest human settlement on Earth at that time. Imagine the complexity required to organize such a population, the systems of food distribution, water management, social hierarchy, and yes, cultural production including music. The Sumerians came first, establishing city-states around 3500 before the Common Era. They developed cuneiform writing, built massive temple complexes, created sophisticated irrigation systems, and established the foundations of Mesopotamian culture. The Akkadians, a Semitic people, came next, sometimes conquering Sumerian cities, sometimes coexisting with them, always absorbing and adapting Sumerian cultural achievements. Sargon of Akkad, ruling around 2300 before the Common Era, created what many scholars consider the world's first empire, uniting Sumerian and Akkadian territories under one rule. His daughter, as we'll see, would become history's first named composer. After Sargon's empire fell, the Sumerians experienced a final flowering during the Third Dynasty of Ur, around 2100 to 2000, before the Common Era, before gradually being absorbed into the broader Mesopotamian cultural mix. The Babylonians rose to prominence around 1800 before the Common Era under King Hammurabi, famous for his law code. Later, the Assyrians built a militaristic empire from their northern heartland, reaching their greatest extent around 700. Before the Common Era, before falling to the Babylonians, who experienced a final glorious period, the Neo-Babylonian Empire from 626 to 539, before the Common Era. Each of these civilizations built upon the achievements of those who came before, maintaining remarkable cultural continuity, even as political power shifted. Musical traditions established by the Sumerians continued, with modifications, through all these succeeding cultures. A hymn composed in Sumerian might still be performed in the same language now understood only by scholars in a Babylonian temple 2,000 years later. Egypt, meanwhile, developed along the Nile, that extraordinary river that flows north through desert, bringing life to a narrow strip of land that would otherwise be barren. The Greek historian Herodotus, writing in the 5th century before the Common Era, called Egypt the gift of the Nile, and he was right. Without the river's annual flood, depositing rich black silt across the floodplain, Egyptian civilization would have been impossible. The Egyptian civilization we'll explore tonight spans an enormous period. The traditional chronology divides it into kingdoms and intermediate periods. The early dynastic period and Old Kingdom, from approximately 3100 to 2170 before the Common Era, saw the construction of the Great Pyramids and the establishment of pharaonic power. The first intermediate period brought political fragmentation, followed by the Middle Kingdom's reunification from 2040 to 1780, before the Common Era. After the second intermediate period, which included the Hyksos domination of northern Egypt, came the New Kingdom from 1550 to 1070 before the Common Era. This was Egypt's imperial age, when pharaohs like Thutmose III and Ramesses II extended Egyptian power deep into Syria and Nubia. It was also a period of extraordinary cultural flowering, including significant developments in music. The late period, from 700 to 32, before the Common Era, saw Egypt increasingly dominated by foreign powers, Nubians, Assyrians, Persians, and finally Alexander the Great's Greeks. Yet even under foreign rule, Egyptian culture maintained its distinctive character, its musical traditions adapting but not disappearing. Both civilizations were fundamentally agricultural, their wealth built upon grain. In Mesopotamia, barley was the primary crop, supplemented by wheat, dates, and vegetables. The annual flooding of the Tigris and Euphrates was less predictable than the Nile's flood, requiring extensive irrigation works. Canals, dikes, and reservoirs transformed the landscape, creating one of the most productive agricultural systems in the ancient world. This agricultural surplus meant that not everyone needed to farm. Specialization became possible. Some people could devote themselves entirely to pottery, metalworking, weaving, administration, religious service, and yes, music. The existence of professional musicians depended on this agricultural surplus. A society where everyone must work the fields from dawn to dusk has no room for full-time harpists. In Egypt, the Nile's predictable annual flood made agriculture somewhat easier, though still requiring careful management. The flood came each year between June and September, deposited its fertile silt, and receded, leaving behind soil ready for planting. Farmers planted wheat and barley in October, harvested in March and April, then the cycle began again. This predictability gave Egyptian civilization a sense of order and stability, reflected in its conservative cultural traditions, including musical ones. The economic systems of both civilizations were complex. While we often think of ancient economies as simple, based on barter, in fact, both Mesopotamia and Egypt developed sophisticated systems of accounting and resource management. Temple complexes and royal palaces functioned as economic centers, collecting agricultural surplus in the form of taxes and redistributing it as rations to workers, including musicians. A temple musician in might receive a monthly ration: so many liters of barley, so much oil, so many fish, a specific allocation of beer. These rations were recorded on clay tablets by scribes, creating an administrative paper trail that modern archaeologists have excavated and studied. We can sometimes trace individual musicians across multiple documents, following their careers through the bureaucratic record. Trade networks extended across vast distances. Mesopotamian merchants traveled to the Persian Gulf, to Anatolia, even to the Indus Valley, trading grain, textiles, and manufactured goods for materials unavailable locally: timber, stone, metals, precious stones. Egyptian traders sailed the Mediterranean and the Red Sea, venturing south into Nubia and east into the Levant. These trade networks carried more than goods. They carried ideas, including musical ones. A merchant who'd heard Syrian music might describe it to musicians back home, who might incorporate elements into their own performances. An Egyptian diplomat visiting a Hittite court might bring back songs learned during the visit. Cultural exchange happened slowly, but it happened, creating a broader Near Eastern musical world with regional variations. Social hierarchies were steep in both civilizations. At the top stood kings, the Lugal and Sumerian city-states, later the Sharakin, or true king of empires, the pharaoh in Egypt who was considered a living god. Below them came nobles, priests, high officials, each with their retinues and households. Musicians serving in royal courts enjoyed high status, their proximity to power conferring prestige. Temple establishments formed another hierarchy. High priests wielded enormous power, administering vast estates and commanding large staffs. Musicians were part of these staffs, their position depending on their role. A lead singer or master harpist ranked higher than a novice or a simple drummer, just as in any organized profession. Below the elite came artisans, merchants, scribes, free people who worked for wages or who practiced independent trades. Musicians in this category might work on commission, hired for specific occasions: a wedding, a funeral, a festival. Their income was less secure than temple musicians, but potentially more lucrative if they were skilled and popular. At the bottom were slaves, though slavery in these ancient societies was different from later chattel slavery. Many slaves were war captives, or debt slaves who might eventually work off their obligations. Some held positions of responsibility in great households. A talented slave musician might live quite comfortably, even owning property, though legally remaining unfree. These were deeply religious societies, and understanding their religion is essential to understanding their music, because the two were inseparable. The Mesopotamians worshipped a complex pantheon of gods, each controlling different aspects of the cosmos. Anu was the sky god, remote and powerful. Enlil commanded the winds and storms. Enki, god of wisdom, dwelt in the underground freshwater ocean. Inanna, called Ishtar by the Akkadians, was the goddess of love and war, passionate and dangerous. Each city had its patron deity, whose temple formed the city's spiritual and often economic center. These gods weren't abstract principles, but personalities with desires, moods, and needs. They required food, which worshippers provided through sacrifices. They appreciated beauty, which humans offered through art, architecture, and music. They demanded respect, which hymns and prayers expressed. Religion was transactional. Humans served the gods, and in return, the gods, hopefully, provided prosperity, victory in war, health, and long life. Temples weren't just places of worship, but economic powerhouses. The great ziggurat of Ur, dedicated to the moon god Nana, administered vast agricultural estates, employed hundreds of workers, maintained workshops for craftsmen, and housed schools for scribes. Music was integral to this complex operation, with dawn hymns greeting the god, offerings accompanied by song, major festivals requiring elaborate musical performances. Egyptian religion shared some features with Mesopotamian but had its own distinctive character. The Egyptians also worshipped many gods: Ra, the sun god; Osiris, the god of the afterlife; Isis, the great mother; Horus, the sky god; Thoth, the god of wisdom and writing, and dozens more. But Egyptian religion was particularly focused on death and the afterlife. The Egyptians believed that proper burial and the performance of correct rituals could ensure a pleasant afterlife. Hence the elaborate tomb construction, the mummification, the burial goods, and the funerary music. Musicians performed at funerals not merely to mourn, but to actively help the deceased transition to the afterlife. The music had magical function, its rhythms and melodies facilitating the soul's journey. Pharaoh stood at the center of Egyptian religion. He wasn't just a political ruler, but a god on earth, the intermediary between the human and divine realms. When Pharaoh performed rituals, including those involving music, he maintained cosmic order, balance, truth. Disruption of Ma'at brought chaos, so proper performance of religious duties, including musical ones, had cosmological significance. Writing emerged in both civilizations almost simultaneously, around 3200 before the Common Era. Though possibly independently, the Sumerians developed cuneiform, pressing wedge-shaped marks into wet clay tablets with a reed stylus. The system began as pictographs but evolved into a complex script combining syllabic and logographic elements, capable of expressing any thought. The Egyptians created hieroglyphics, their beautiful pictographic script. The word means sacred carvings, and indeed, hieroglyphs were often carved into stone temple walls or tomb chambers. For everyday purposes, Egyptians used cursive forms of the script, hieratic and later demotic, written with brush and ink on papyrus. This invention of writing changed everything, including music. For the first time, humans could record not just that music happened, but sometimes even details about how it was performed. Hymn texts could be preserved exactly. Instructions for rituals, including their musical components, could be written down and consulted. Eventually, tentative steps toward musical notation appeared, attempts to capture not just words but the sounds themselves. Intellectual life in both civilizations was sophisticated. Mesopotamian scholars developed advanced mathematics, creating the sexagesimal base, 60-number system we still use for measuring time and angles. They were skilled astronomers, tracking the movements of planets and stars with remarkable precision. They compiled extensive lists and lexicons, categorizing everything from types of trees to synonyms for words, an impulse towards systematic knowledge that extended to music. Egyptian scholars likewise pursued mathematics, though often more practically oriented towards surveying and construction. Their astronomical observations were less detailed than the Mesopotamians, but sufficient for their needs, particularly creating an accurate calendar. Medical texts reveal surprisingly sophisticated understanding of anatomy and disease treatment. In both civilizations, the boundary between what we'd call science and religion was non-existent. Astronomical observations served astrological purposes. Mathematical knowledge was sacred wisdom. Music theory connected to cosmology, the belief that the structure of the universe itself had musical properties, that the gods themselves rejoiced in properly ordered sound. This worldview, where everything connects to everything else, where the mundane and sacred interpenetrate, where music serves not just aesthetic but magical functions, this worldview shaped ancient music profoundly. When we try to understand that music, we must try to enter this mindset, so foreign to modern secular thinking, where a song isn't just entertainment but an action in the world, capable of influencing gods and shaping reality. 2. Let us begin in Sumer, in the city of Ur, around 2300 before the Common Era. Here lived a remarkable woman named Enheduanna. She was the daughter of Sargon of Akkad, who united the Sumerian city-states into the world's first empire. Sargon appointed his daughter as high priestess of the moon god Nanna in Ur, a position of enormous power both religiously and politically. This appointment was strategic. By placing his daughter in this crucial religious position, Sargon linked his new Akkadian dynasty to the ancient Sumerian religious establishment. Enheduanna wasn't merely performing religious duties. She was helping to legitimize her father's rule, using religion to build political unity across an ethnically diverse empire. But Enheduanna was far more than a political pawn. She was a poet of genuine brilliance and, we believe, a composer, the first composer in history whose name we know with certainty. She created a series of hymns to the goddess Inanna, passionate and personal works that reveal a sophisticated understanding of both literary and musical form. These weren't anonymous temple chants, but authored compositions, works bearing the unmistakable mark of an individual creative mind. Imagine Enheduanna in her temple complex, the great ziggurat of Nanna looming over the city. She's in her private chambers, perhaps, or in a room set aside for composition and study. Scribes sit ready, their styluses poised over soft clay tablets. Musicians wait nearby singers who will learn the new hymn, harpists who will accompany them. She's composing a hymn to Inanna, and the words flow in both Sumerian and Akkadian. Enheduanna was bilingual, probably trilingual if we count the Emissal language, a special linguistic register used in religious contexts. Her hymns demonstrate masterful command of poetic technique parallelism, where ideas are stated and then restated with variation, chiasmus, where elements repeat in reverse order, alliteration and assonance creating musical patterns in the language itself. As she composes, she's thinking not just about words but about sound. How will this phrase be sung? What melodic contour suits these words? Where should the harp interject, and where should voice alone carry the text? She knows it will be performed, that trained singers will give voice to her words, that instrumentalists will support them. She's creating for specific performers in a specific acoustic space the great temple of Inanna in Uruk or her own temple complex in Ur. She signs her work. This is crucial. At the end of several hymns, we find verses that identify Enheduanna by name and title. I, Enheduanna, High Priestess of Nanna, will recite a prayer to you. By naming herself, she establishes something revolutionary, the concept of the composer as an individual artist, not merely an anonymous functionary serving the gods. Her hymns survived because they were copied and recopied for centuries. Student scribes practiced their writing by transcribing Enheduanna's works, which tells us they were considered classics, models of excellence. Some of these copies come from more than 500 years after her death, suggesting her hymns remained in active use for half a millennium longer than the period from Bach to the present day. What can we know about Enheduanna as a person? The historical record is frustratingly sparse, but her hymns provide glimpses of an individual personality. In the Exaltation of Inanna, she describes being driven from her position by a political rival, forced into exile. The hymn becomes a plea for the goddess to restore her. Verily, I had entered my holy cloister at your behest. I, the high priestess, I, Enheduanna. I carried the ritual basket, I intoned the song of joy. Now I am placed in the leper's ward, I cannot even find my own conclusion. The anguish is palpable, personal, real. This isn't formulaic religious language, but the voice of someone in genuine distress, turning to her goddess for help. Whether Enheduanna actually was exiled or whether this is a literary convention is debated by scholars, but either way, it reveals a sophisticated approach to religious poetry, one that embraces individual emotion rather than hiding behind impersonal formulas. The musicians who performed Enheduanna's hymns and other temple music were professionals, members of a recognized occupation with defined roles and responsibilities. In Sumerian society, musicians had official titles. The nar was a singer, often male. The gala were a special class of temple singers, possibly castrati, who sang in the Emesal language during certain rituals. The bala played the balag drum and likely composed the laments performed at temple ceremonies. The tabuta played a type of tambourine. These weren't casual designations but professional identities, recorded in temple payrolls and administrative documents. Temple archives from Nippur, and other cities list musicians by name, sometimes noting their specialties and their family relationships. We read, Ur-Ningirsu, son of Ur-Enlil, a singer, or Lu-Dingira, daughter of Enki-Mansum, a harpist. These brief notations represent entire lives devoted to musical service. Musicians received regular rations of grain, oil, and beer, the staples of Mesopotamian life. The amounts varied based on rank and seniority. A master musician might receive generous rations, enough to support a family comfortably. A novice or assistant would receive less. Some records indicate special bonuses during major festivals, when musicians' work was particularly intensive. Housing was sometimes provided. Temple complexes included residences for their staffs, and musicians lived alongside priests, scribes, and other temple workers. This created a community of religious professionals, living and working in close proximity, their lives centered on the temple's rhythms and rituals. Training for musicians appears to have been rigorous and began young. A text from the Old Babylonian period mentions the house of learning where boys were taught singing and instrumental performance. The education lasted years, with students progressing through established stages. First came basic vocal training and introduction to simple instruments. Then came memorization of the standard repertoire hymns, laments, liturgical songs. Advanced students learned composition, improvisation, and the theoretical principles underlying musical practice. This training was often hereditary. A musician's children frequently entered the same profession, beginning their education at home from earliest childhood. By the time they entered formal schooling, they already had foundational skills. This created musical dynasties, families known for particular expertise passed down through generations. The daily life of a temple musician followed the temple's ritual calendar. Dawn services required music, as did evening prayers. Monthly festivals on auspicious days involved elaborate ceremonies with corresponding musical demands. Annual festivals could last for days, with musicians performing multiple times daily. But there was also routine maintenance. Instruments required constant care, strings broke and needed replacement, drums needed reheading, harps and lyres required tuning. Musicians were responsible for this maintenance, just as a modern orchestral player maintains their own instrument. Practice was necessary. Professional standards demanded technical proficiency. A singer had to maintain their voice through regular exercises. An instrumentalist had to keep their fingers nimble and their timing precise. Time was set aside for practice, both individual and ensemble. Teaching consumed significant time for senior musicians. Every generation had to pass their knowledge to the next. A master singer would work with younger singers, correcting their technique, teaching them proper pronunciation of archaic Sumerian texts, demonstrating how to ornament a melody effectively. An experienced harpist would guide students through finger positions, plucking techniques, the art of tuning. There were also performances outside the temple. Wealthy individuals hired musicians for private ceremonies, weddings, funerals, birthday celebrations. This provided additional income beyond temple rations. A skilled musician might be in demand, balancing temple obligations with lucrative private engagements. Competition and jealousy surely existed, though direct evidence is limited. One letter fragment from the Old Babylonian period shows one musician complaining about another. The singer speaks against me to the overseer. Yet my voice is strong and my hymns are well performed. Why does he seek to diminish me? Very human dynamics, recognizable across the millennia. The social status of musicians was complex and somewhat contradictory. On one hand, they served the gods, performing sacred functions that made them religiously important. They had access to temple precincts forbidden to ordinary people. They participated in rituals essential to cosmic order. This conferred prestige. On the other hand, they were servants of the gods, yes, but also of the temple administration, subject to overseers and administrators who might or might not appreciate musical excellence. They depended on those rations, on maintaining their position within the temple hierarchy. Loss of favor could mean loss of livelihood. Gender dynamics in Mesopotamian music are interesting and not entirely clear. Both men and women served as musicians. Women appear as singers, harpists, and percussionists. The Gala, that special class of liturgical singers, were designated with a symbol combining the signs for man and woman, which has led to various interpretations. Perhaps they were eunuchs. Perhaps they were understood as occupying a third gender category. Some positions appear to have been gender-specific. The nar singer was typically male, but female singers are also well attested, particularly in later periods. Harpists could be either male or female, though some pictorial evidence suggests female harpists were more common in certain contexts, particularly entertainment music rather than liturgical performance. What's clear is that music was one avenue for women to achieve professional status and even a degree of independence. A skilled female musician had marketable skills, could earn income, and enjoyed a position of respect. In a society where women's options were often limited, this was significant. In Egypt, the situation was similar in many ways, but with distinctive Egyptian features that reflected broader differences between Egyptian and Mesopotamian society. Egyptian musicians served in temples, in royal courts, and in wealthy households. Some were professionals, their occupation listed in tomb inscriptions alongside scribes, physicians, and artisans. Others were slaves, though slave musicians in elite households might enjoy considerable prestige and comfort. Still others were members of wealthy families, for whom musical skill was a mark of refinement rather than a livelihood. The temples employed large musical staffs. The great temple of Amun at Karnak, during the New Kingdom, had hundreds of musicians on its payroll. Most were singers, divided into various categories. The regular temple singers performed daily hymns. The Shimayet were a special class of female temple singers, their title derived from the word for follower or adherent. The Hesetu were singers who accompanied processions and rituals with sistra metal rattles sacred to Hathor, goddess of music and love. Harpists held positions of particular honor. The harp was the most prestigious instrument in ancient Egypt, associated with both religious ritual and high-status entertainment. Master harpists could be famous, their names recorded in inscriptions, their tombs decorated with scenes of their performances. One such harpist was Harmos, who served in the Temple of Amun during the 18th dynasty, around 1400 before the Common Era. His tomb in Thebes includes an inscription praising his skill, the sweet singer who makes the god content, whose voice drives away sorrow, who fills the temple with joy. These weren't empty formulas. Harmos was renowned for his abilities, and someone his family perhaps, or colleagues ensured that reputation was preserved in stone. The title chantress appears frequently in New Kingdom inscriptions. A chantress was a female temple singer, but the title carried social prestige beyond mere occupation. The wives and daughters of high officials often held this title. In some cases, it may have been primarily honorific. They had the right to participate in certain temple ceremonies but weren't professional musicians. In other cases, however, chantresses were clearly skilled performers who sang regularly in temple services. Royal courts maintained separate musical establishments. Pharaoh's court included professional musicians who entertained at banquets, accompanied religious ceremonies, and performed during official occasions. These court musicians enjoyed high status, their proximity to the god-king conferring great prestige. They received valuable gifts, gold, land grants, exemptions from taxes, and their positions were sometimes hereditary. One fascinating document from the reign of Ramesses III, 1186 to 1155, before the Common Era, lists the contents of a temple donation. Among the items are singers, 79 men, female singers, 9 women, cymbal players, 19 girls. The specificity is notable, not just musicians but specific roles, specific numbers. This suggests careful organization, a recognition of music's importance in temple operations. Private households of the elite also employed musicians. A wealthy nobleman might maintain singers and instrumentalists who performed at dinner parties, entertained guests, and demonstrated the host's cultural sophistication. These musicians might be slaves or free persons hired on contract. The tomb of Nakht, a scribe under Thutmose IV, includes a famous painting of blind musicians performing at a banquet, a harpist, a lutenist, and a flutist. Their faces serene, suggesting music provided employment opportunities even for those with disabilities. Women played a prominent role in Egyptian music, more so than in Mesopotamia, and certainly more so than in many later civilizations. Women served as singers, harpists, lutenists, and percussionists. Female dancers often performed alongside musicians, their movements responding to the music's rhythms. The sistrum, a rattle sacred to Hathor, was played almost exclusively by women, often priestesses. This female prominence in music probably relates to music's association with Hathor, the goddess of music, dance, love, and joy. Hathor was one of Egypt's most important deities, and activities under her patronage carried divine sanction. Music making, especially with the sistrum, was a form of worship, making female musicians not just entertainers but religious functionaries. One letter from the New Kingdom gives us a wonderful glimpse into a musician's working life and its frustrations. The letter, written by a temple musician to a colleague, complains about working conditions. "You are aware of my situation. The overseer demands 3 performances daily, yet my hands pain me from constant playing. The promised rations of bread and beer have not arrived for 2 weeks. How am I to maintain my strength? Speak to the administrator on my behalf." This letter, preserved by chance on a scrap of papyrus, humanizes ancient musicians wonderfully. Across 33 centuries, we hear a working musician's frustrations, so familiar they could have been written yesterday. The physical toll of performance, the administrative incompetence, the unreliable pay, these experiences unite musicians across time. Training in Egypt appears to have followed patterns similar to Mesopotamia. Young people entered temple or court service and learned their craft through apprenticeship. A novice might spend years watching, listening, memorizing, gradually taking on simple performance responsibilities before advancing to more complex roles. Some evidence suggests formal schools for musicians existed, particularly in larger temple complexes. A text from the Ptolemaic period 305 to 30, before the Common Era, admittedly very late, mentions the house of books in the Temple of Hathor where singers were trained. Whether such institutions existed in earlier periods is unknown, but the need for systematic musical education surely existed. Notation in Egypt was even more limited than in Mesopotamia. We have no Egyptian musical notation that has been definitively deciphered. What survives are hymn texts, descriptions of performances, depictions of musicians, and the instruments themselves. From these fragments, scholars attempt to reconstruct Egyptian musical practice, but the actual sounds remain elusive, requiring imagination informed by evidence from later Egyptian musical traditions and comparative ethnomusicology. What did this ancient music actually sound like? We must piece together an answer from fragments and educated guesses. But those fragments, though tantalizing, are maddeningly incomplete. Let's begin with scales, the fundamental building blocks of melody. The Mesopotamians and Egyptians didn't use our modern major and minor scales, those patterns of whole steps and half steps that form the basis of Western classical music. Instead, evidence suggests they employed various modes, scales with different patterns of intervals, creating musical flavors quite different from what we're accustomed to. The most substantial evidence comes from Babylonian texts dating to the Old Babylonian period, around 1800 before the Common Era. These tablets, discovered at various sites but particularly at Ur and Nippur, contain what appear to be theoretical discussions of musical scales and tuning systems. One tablet lists 7 different scale names, each apparently designating a different musical mode: Needkabli, Nishgaba, Ari, Mbubu, Ishartum, and 3 others whose names are damaged beyond reconstruction. Scholars have debated these texts intensely. What exactly do these terms mean? Do they describe scales, tuning systems, string names, or something else entirely? The consensus, though not universal, is that they describe different modes, different patterns of intervals that a musician could use to construct a melody. One interpretation, proposed by scholars like Anne Kilmer and David Woolston, suggests these modes were built on a 7-note scale, similar in range to our octave, but with different internal intervals. The modes would be created by starting the scale on different notes, just as the medieval church modes were created. A melody in Needkabli mode would emphasize different notes and have a different character than one in Mbubu mode. One particularly fascinating text from ancient Ugarit, a city on the Syrian coast, provides our most concrete evidence of ancient musical notation. Dating to around 1300 before the Common Era, the Hurrian Hymn to Nikal is inscribed on a clay tablet in cuneiform. While Ugarit isn't technically Mesopotamia or Egypt, it was deeply influenced by both civilizations, and this hymn likely reflects broader Near Eastern musical practices. The tablet contains both the hymn text and instructions for performance. The instructions appear to specify tuning intervals for a 9-stringed lyre and indicate which strings should be plucked for different passages. When modern scholars and musicians attempt to realize this notation, they produce music that sounds exotic to our ears, neither major nor minor but something else, something that feels genuinely ancient. The scale used in the Ugarit hymn appears to be diatonic, meaning it uses 7 different pitches within the octave, similar to our major and minor scales. But the specific intervals, the distances between these pitches, differ from our modern scales. The result is modal music, music where the pattern of intervals creates a distinctive flavor, an atmosphere that's both familiar because it uses a 7-note scale and strange because the specific pattern is foreign to our ears. For Egypt, evidence about scales is even more fragmentary. We have no Egyptian equivalent to the Babylonian theoretical texts or the Ugarit notation. What we have instead are the instruments themselves, which can tell us something about the pitches available to Egyptian musicians. Egyptian harps varied in size from small portable instruments with 5 or 6 strings to large floor harps with 20 or more strings. The number of strings tells us something about the scale system. A harp with 7 strings suggests a 7-note scale, while one with more strings might indicate chromatic notes, pitches outside the basic scale, or simply an extended range covering multiple octaves. Flutes and reed instruments provide additional clues. The finger holes on surviving Egyptian flutes are spaced in ways that allow analysis. When these instruments are reconstructed and played, they produce scales that, like the Mesopotamian ones, sound modal, not quite major, not quite minor, but something distinctive. Ethnomusicological comparison offers another approach. Musical traditions in remote areas sometimes preserve ancient practices. Some scholars have studied traditional music in rural Egypt, Nubia, and Yemen, looking for patterns that might reflect ancient practices. These modern traditional musics often use modal scales, pentatonic, 5-note scales, and ornamentation patterns that could plausibly descend from ancient traditions. Of course, such comparisons must be made cautiously. 3,000 years is a long time, and musical traditions change. We can't simply assume that modern Egyptian folk music sounds like ancient Egyptian temple music. But neither should we ignore the possibility that certain fundamental practices, the use of particular scales, certain melodic formulas, specific ornamentation patterns, might have persisted across the centuries, maintained by oral tradition even as the civilization that created them vanished. Melody in ancient music appears to have been largely stepwise, moving from one note to the next note in the scale rather than leaping around. This makes sense given the instruments. A harp or lyre plays most naturally in stepwise motion, the fingers moving from string to adjacent string. The voice, too, finds stepwise motion easiest for long stretches of singing, particularly when memorizing complex texts. But there were certainly leaps as well, moments of drama where the melody jumped upward or downward for emphasis. We can infer this from later musical traditions that claimed ancient roots, and from the occasional more detailed depictions of performance that suggest dynamic variation. A hymn praising a god's power might leap upward on key words, the voice soaring to express exaltation. A lament might feature downward leaps, the falling melody embodying grief. Melodic range, the distance between the lowest and highest notes in a melody, was probably moderate by our standards. The human voice, the primary instrument, has limits. Most people can comfortably sing within a range of about an octave to an octave and a half. Ancient melodies likely stayed within this comfortable range, allowing multiple singers to perform together without some straining to reach extreme pitches. Ornamentation was almost certainly important, though we can only speculate about its specific character. In oral musical traditions worldwide, ornaments, decorative notes added to a basic melody, are essential. A melody written as simple stepwise motion would, in performance, be elaborated with trills, turns, grace notes, and melismas, the stretching of one syllable across multiple notes. Egyptian tomb paintings sometimes show singers with their hands raised to their ears, a gesture still used by traditional singers in the Middle East to help them hear their own voice and control pitch precisely. This suggests careful attention to exact pitches and subtle pitch variations, microtones, intervals smaller than the half step, which might have been used as ornaments or expressive devices. Rhythm is even harder to reconstruct than melody, but we know these cultures valued it deeply. The prominence of drums and clappers in temple scenes, the frequent references to percussion in texts, the elaborate rhythmic organization of poetry all indicate that rhythm was fundamental to ancient music. Mesopotamian poetry, which was often sung, used quantitative meter, where syllables are classified as long or short based on vowel length and consonant clusters. A long syllable took approximately twice as long to pronounce as a short syllable. Poets arranged these long and short syllables into patterns, creating rhythmic feats similar to those in classical Greek and Latin poetry. A typical Sumerian hymn might use a meter where each line contains a specific pattern of long and short syllables. For example, a pattern might be long, short, short, long, short, short, long, long, creating a lilting rhythm. When sung, the melody would naturally reflect this rhythmic pattern, with longer notes on long syllables and shorter notes on short syllables, or possibly with ornaments extending long syllables. The musical rhythm thus grew organically from the text's rhythm. This is quite different from later European art music, where music and text sometimes work independently, the music imposing its own rhythm on the words. In ancient Near Eastern music, text appears to have been primary, music serving to enhance and project the words. But instrumental music must have followed its own rhythmic logic, independent of text. When a harpist played an interlude between verses of a hymn, what rhythmic principles guided the performance? We don't know for certain, but we can make educated guesses. Likely, instrumental rhythms were organized into regular patterns, repeated cycles that provided structure. World music traditions suggest this is nearly universal. Irregular, constantly changing rhythms are difficult to maintain and to coordinate among multiple performers. Regular patterns, whether simple like a steady beat or complex like the intricate talas of Indian music, provide a framework that performers can internalize and follow. Some scholars suggest that ancient music used rhythmic modes, repeated rhythmic patterns that gave structure to compositions. A particular hymn might be performed in a specific rhythmic mode, just as it would be sung in a specific melodic mode. A musician learning the hymn would learn both its melody and its characteristic rhythm. The role of percussion in ancient music was clearly important. Mesopotamian temples maintained inventories of drums, and texts sometimes mentioned specific drum types. The balag, a large drum; the lilisu, a smaller drum; the adapa, perhaps a tambourine-like instrument. Egyptian temples likewise had various percussion instruments: the tof drum, menet, a beaded necklace that rattled; sistrum rattle, and various clappers. These percussion instruments didn't merely mark a beat. Different drums had different sounds, deep and resonant, or sharp and cutting. Different striking techniques produced different timbres. A skilled drummer could create complex patterns, layering different sounds to create rhythmic texture. Some tomb paintings show Egyptian percussionists playing while singers and melodic instrumentalists perform. The percussionist's hands are blurred in the paintings, suggesting rapid motion, complex patterns of strikes. This isn't just timekeeping, but rhythmic artistry, contributing to the music's overall effect. Dance music, and there was certainly dance, would have had clear, strong rhythms. Dancers need to hear the beat, need predictable patterns to coordinate their movements. Egyptian tomb paintings show dancers performing acrobatic movements, backbends, high kicks, complex footwork. Such dancing requires music with clearly articulated rhythm, probably faster in tempo than hymns or work songs. Work songs would have had rhythms matching the work's rhythm. A group hauling a stone for pyramid construction would pull in unison, and the song would coordinate that pulling. The rhythm would be steady, inexorable, matching the slow, sustained effort required. A blacksmith hammering metal would sing to the rhythm of the hammer strikes, the song helping maintain the regular, rapid rhythm essential to the work. Tempo, the speed at which music was performed, varied by context. Temple hymns were probably slow to moderate, dignified and stately, giving weight to the sacred texts. Entertainment music might be faster, more energetic. Funeral music would be slow, a measured pace reflecting the solemn occasion. Work songs would match the work's natural rhythm, slow for heavy hauling, faster for repetitive light tasks. Did ancient musicians use rubato, the speeding up and slowing down, for expressive effect that's common in later Western music? Probably, though it would have been subtle, controlled, tied to textual meaning. A singer might slow slightly before a climactic word, then resume the original tempo. Or an instrumentalist might accelerate gradually through a passage, creating excitement, then suddenly drop back to the original tempo. Time signatures, the organization of beats into regular groups, are a later European invention, but the concept they represent is probably universal. Music organizes beats into patterns. 2-beat patterns, strong, weak, create a marching rhythm. 3-beat patterns, strong, weak, create a lilting, dance-like rhythm. 4-beat patterns offer stability and balance. Ancient music probably used all these patterns, choosing appropriate ones for different occasions and purposes. Complex polymeter, where different instruments play in different time signatures simultaneously, seems unlikely for ancient music. Such complexity requires sophisticated coordination and is primarily found in very specific later traditions. Ancient music probably featured rhythmic unison, everyone following the same basic rhythmic pattern, though with variations in ornamentation creating slight differences. Part 3. The texture of ancient music, how different musical lines relate to each other, was likely quite different from what we're used to in Western classical music. There's no evidence of harmony in the Western sense of multiple notes sounding simultaneously in carefully controlled relationships, creating chords and chord progressions. The concept of harmony, where different pitches combine to create specific effects, consonance and dissonance, tension and resolution, appears to have developed much later, primarily in medieval Europe. Instead, we probably have heterophony, multiple musicians playing or singing the same melody but with slight variations, creating a complex, shimmering texture. Imagine a temple ceremony, several singers intoning a hymn, each adding their own ornaments and variations to the basic melody. One might sustain certain notes while another moves on. One might add a trill while another sings the note straight. The result would be unified in intent but varied in execution, a kind of organized spontaneity. This heterophonic texture appears in many traditional musics worldwide, in Arabic music, in traditional Greek music, in some African traditions, in certain Chinese ensemble music. It's a natural texture for music that's primarily melodic, where the melody is paramount and everything else serves to enhance it. Drone notes may have been used, a single sustained pitch over which melodies unfold. Some Egyptian harps had bass strings that could have provided such drones. The effect of a drone is to anchor the music, providing a tonal center that all melodic movement references. It creates a meditative quality, an unchanging foundation beneath changing melodies, particularly appropriate for religious music where the divine represents constancy amid earthly change. Call and response between voice and instrument was likely common. A singer might sing a phrase, then pause while a harp echoed the melody or responded with a complementary phrase. Or different singers might alternate, one singing a line, another responding, building the hymn through dialogue. This responsive texture is found in many traditional musics and serves both practical and aesthetic purposes. It rests individual voices, prevents monotony, and creates a sense of conversation. Unison singing, everyone singing exactly the same melody on the same pitches, would have occurred when large groups performed together. Festival processions with dozens of singers wouldn't have attempted elaborate heterophony. They'd have sung in unison, creating power through massed voices all delivering the same melody. Octave doubling, men and women singing the same melody but an octave apart, would have happened naturally when mixed groups sang. Adult male and female voices naturally sit about an octave apart in range. When they sing together without thinking about it, they often automatically double at the octave. This creates a fuller sound than unison alone, though it's not harmony in the Western sense, since both are singing the same note, just in different octaves. Timbre, the distinctive quality of different sounds, was clearly important to ancient musicians. They had access to varied sound sources, each with its own character. String instruments, harps and lyres, primarily produced plucked sounds, bright when the strings were new, mellower as they aged. Different plucking techniques would have produced different timbres. Plucking near the instrument's bridge creates a bright, sharp sound. Plucking in the middle creates a rounder, fuller sound. Plucking very gently creates a delicate, whispering sound. Wind instruments, flutes, and reed instruments had their own distinctive sounds. Flutes, typically made of reed or bone, produced pure, hollow tones. Double reed instruments, ancestors of our oboes, produced more nasal, penetrating sounds. The ancient aulos, a Greek double reed instrument, Greece being just outside our focus tonight but closely related to Near Eastern traditions, was described by writers as exciting and even disturbing, its sound piercing and insistent. Percussion offered the widest timbral variety. Drums of different sizes and materials produced everything from deep, resonant booms to sharp cracking sounds. Metal cymbals and sistra produced bright, shimmering sounds. Wooden clappers created sharp, rhythmic clicks. A skilled percussionist could create an entire palette of colors, each contributing to the music's overall texture. The human voice itself offers immense timbral variety: chest voice versus head voice, open throat versus constricted, vibrato versus straight tone. Singers can manipulate their vocal production to create different effects. Ancient singers surely employed these techniques, choosing appropriate vocal colors for different texts and occasions. Register differences: how high or low voices or instruments sound contributed to texture. A bass voice or a large drum provides foundation, weight, gravitas. A high voice or a small flute provides brightness, delicacy, transcendence. Music that employs both extremes creates a sense of completeness, of encompassing the full range of sound. Dynamics loud and soft are rarely mentioned in ancient texts, but they must have been used expressively. A hymn might begin softly, multiple voices entering gradually, building to a climax of full volume, then subsiding back to quiet for the ending. This creates dramatic shape, prevents monotony, expresses meaning through volume changes. Temple acoustics shaped timbre significantly. Large stone chambers with high ceilings create substantial reverberation. A note sung in such a space lingers, blending with the next note, creating a wash of sound quite different from the same music performed in a small room or outdoors. Ancient musicians surely understood this, adapting their performances to the acoustic environment. Outdoor performances, processions, festivals held in temple courtyards required different approaches. Without resonant spaces to amplify sound, performers would need to project more forcefully. Percussion becomes more important outdoors, its sharp sounds cutting through ambient noise. This environmental adaptation meant the same hymn might sound quite different depending on where it was performed. While we focused on the great civilizations of Mesopotamia and Egypt, music flourished throughout the ancient Near East, often influenced by these cultural giants but developing its own distinctive character in each region. The Hittites, who built an empire in Anatolia, modern-day Turkey, from around 1700 to 1200, before the Common Era, absorbed Mesopotamian musical traditions while adding their own elements. Their capital, Hattusa, located in the highlands of central Anatolia, has yielded archaeological evidence of musical life. Excavations at Hattusa have revealed fragments of musical instruments, drum frames, pieces of what may have been lyres, small bells. More significant are the cuneiform texts found in the royal archives. The Hittites adopted cuneiform writing from Mesopotamia, and their tablets include references to musicians, musical performances, and ritual music. One Hittite text describes a religious festival involving extensive musical performance. Musicians are listed by category: singers, lyre players, drum players. The text specifies which songs should be performed at different points in the ceremony, suggesting a sophisticated organization of ritual music. The song titles are given in Hittite, but some appear to be translations or adaptations of Mesopotamian hymns, indicating cultural borrowing. The Hittites appear to have employed military musicians extensively. Texts mention musicians accompanying the army on campaign, performing before battles to inspire the troops and intimidate enemies. This military use of music parallels Mesopotamian and Egyptian practices, but seems to have been particularly emphasized in Hittite culture, perhaps reflecting their militaristic character. Hittite treaty documents sometimes mention the exchange of musicians between states. One treaty records that the Hittite king gave singers to an allied ruler as part of a diplomatic agreement. This indicates that skilled musicians had value as diplomatic gifts, that musical culture formed part of international relations. To the east, in Elam, in what is now southwestern Iran, musical traditions parallel to those of Mesopotamia developed. The Elamites maintained close but complex relations with Mesopotamia, sometimes trading partners, sometimes enemies. Their capital, Susa, was a major city that at various times fell under Mesopotamian control and at other times ruled independently. Elamite cylinder seals, small carved cylinders used as personal signatures, often depict musical scenes. We see musicians playing harps, lyres, and drums. Processions include instrumentalists. Religious ceremonies show worshippers approaching deities while musicians perform. These images closely resemble Mesopotamian ones, suggesting similar musical practices. One fascinating Elamite artifact is a terracotta plaque showing a group of musicians, a harpist, a drummer, and what appears to be a singer with hands raised. The figures are rendered in a distinctive Elamite style, different from Mesopotamian art, but the instruments and the apparent context are familiar. This suggests a shared musical culture across the region with local artistic variations. Along the Levantine coast, cities like Ugarit, Byblos, and Sidon developed vibrant musical cultures. These port cities were cosmopolitan, exposed to Egyptian, Mesopotamian, and Aegean influences. Ships from Cyprus, Crete, and mainland Greece docked at their harbors. Merchants from across the known world met in their marketplaces. This cosmopolitan character surely influenced their music. The famous hymn notation from Ugarit, which we discussed earlier, represents just one piece of what must have been a rich musical life. The city's excavated temples show evidence of regular musical performance. Tablets mention musicians among temple personnel. The presence of musical notation at all suggests a level of theoretical sophistication, an attempt to standardize and preserve musical knowledge. Ugarit's destruction around 1200 before the Common Era, probably by the Sea Peoples during the Bronze Age collapse, ended this flourishing culture. But its musical legacy may have influenced survivors who fled to other cities, carrying their traditions with them. Phoenician cities like Tyre and Sidon, which rose to prominence after Ugarit's fall, maintained musical traditions that combined local elements with inherited practices. Later classical writers mentioned Phoenician music, describing it as elaborate and sophisticated, though unfortunately providing few specific details about its character. Even in ancient Israel, before the development of the musical traditions described in the Hebrew Bible, evidence suggests musical practices influenced by both Egypt and Mesopotamia. The Israelites, emerging as a distinct people around 1200 before the Common Era, inhabited a land that had been fought over by Egyptian and Mesopotamian empires. They inherited a musical landscape shaped by millennia of cultural exchange. Archaeological evidence from ancient Israel is limited regarding music specifically, but what exists shows familiarity with instruments known from Egypt and Mesopotamia. Clay rattles, bone flutes, bronze cymbals have been found at various sites. Pictorial evidence is scarce, but that small temple model from Tel Rehov, dating to the 10th century before the Common Era, shows what may be a musician, suggesting that music was part of early Israelite religious practice. The evolution of style over time within each culture is difficult to trace with precision, but some patterns emerge when we compare artifacts from different periods. Early Sumerian music, based on the limited evidence from around 2600 before the Common Era, appears to have been closely tied to specific ritual functions. Each ceremony had its appropriate musical forms, and innovation may have been minimal. The emphasis was on proper performance of traditional music, maintaining continuity with the past to ensure divine favor. As Mesopotamian civilization developed through the Akkadian, Old Babylonian, and later periods, we see evidence of increasing sophistication. Longer compositions appear hymns with multiple sections rather than simple single-verse songs. Texts become more complex, showing greater literary artistry. Technical demands on performers seem to increase, with references to musicians who are specially skilled, suggesting that what was being performed required considerable ability. The development of theoretical writings in the Old Babylonian period, around 1800 before the Common Era, indicates an intellectual approach to music, people thinking systematically about scales, tuning, and musical structure. This theoretical thinking both reflects and enables musical development. Once you can articulate principles, you can manipulate them consciously, experiment with variations, innovate within understood frameworks. In Egypt, comparison between Old Kingdom tomb paintings 2700 to 2170 before the Common Era and New Kingdom paintings 1550 to 1070 before the Common Era shows clear evolution. Early paintings show smaller ensembles, simpler instruments, less elaborate scenes. The instruments depicted are primarily harps and flutes with simple percussion. New Kingdom paintings show larger ensembles with greater instrumental variety. We see elaborate harps with many strings, long-necked lutes, probably introduced during the Hyksos period, double reed instruments, more diverse percussion. The scenes themselves are more complex, showing dancers, clapping audiences, musicians in elaborate costumes. This evolution likely reflects genuine musical development. Egypt during the New Kingdom was at its wealthiest and most powerful, its empire extending from Nubia to Syria. This prosperity enabled cultural flowering. Large temple establishments could afford to maintain numerous musicians. Wealthy nobles competed to host the most impressive banquets with the best musical entertainment. This economic and social context supported musical innovation. Cross-cultural influences were significant in the ancient Near East, though tracing specific musical exchanges is challenging given the limited evidence. Trade routes carried more than goods. They carried ideas, including musical ones. A merchant traveling from Ur to Egypt might bring knowledge of Sumerian hymns, perhaps humming a melody heard in the temple before departure. An Egyptian diplomat visiting the Hittite court might witness musical performances and later describe them to musicians back home who might attempt to recreate what was described. These exchanges, impossible to document precisely, nonetheless shaped the musical landscape. We see evidence in the spread of instruments. The long-necked lute, for example, appears in Egyptian art only from the New Kingdom period, around 1500 before the Common Era. It appears to have been introduced by the Hyksos, that Semitic people from the Levant who ruled Egypt during the Second Intermediate Period. The Egyptians initially may have seen this instrument as foreign, associated with their former conquerors, but gradually it was adopted and became part of Egyptian musical culture. By the time of the New Kingdom, Egyptian musicians played the lute alongside traditional harps, creating new timbral possibilities, new ensemble combinations. Similarly, certain types of frame drums appear across the entire Near East with only minor variations, suggesting either common origin or borrowing. The basic concept, a circular frame with animal skin stretched across it, is simple enough that independent invention is possible. But the specific detail, size, decorative patterns, playing techniques depicted in art show enough similarity to suggest cultural transmission. Egyptian influence spread south into Nubia and Kush. The Nubian kingdoms adopted many Egyptian cultural practices, including religious rituals and presumably the music associated with them. Temple reliefs from Nubian sites show musicians that closely resemble those in Egyptian art, playing similar instruments in similar contexts. But Nubia also maintained its own musical traditions, and there may have been reverse influence as well. Nubian practices affecting Egyptian music, particularly during the late period when Nubian pharaohs ruled Egypt. Some scholars have suggested that certain rhythmic patterns in later Egyptian music show African influence, possibly Nubian in origin, though this remains speculative. To the west, Libyan peoples living along Egypt's western border had regular contact with Egyptian civilization, sometimes peaceful, sometimes hostile. Libyan mercenaries served in Egyptian armies. Libyan traders visited Egyptian cities. This contact inevitably involved cultural exchange, including musical. The Sea Peoples, those mysterious groups who attacked Egypt and other Eastern Mediterranean civilizations around 1200 before the Common Era, brought their own musical traditions. We know almost nothing about these, but the fact that some Sea Peoples settled in the Levant, the Philistines being the most famous group, means they brought their music with them, adding another layer to the region's musical complexity. Mesopotamian influence extended far beyond Mesopotamia proper. Akkadian, the language of Babylon and Assyria, became a lingua franca across the Near East during the Late Bronze Age. Diplomatic correspondence from Egypt to Babylon, from the Hittite king to Syrian city-states, was conducted in Akkadian. This linguistic spread surely involved cultural spread, including musical. Texts from various sites show knowledge of Mesopotamian literature, including hymns that were probably sung. A tablet from Hattusha contains a Mesopotamian hymn in Akkadian, suggesting that Hittite temple musicians learned and performed this foreign material. Was it sung in the original Mesopotamian style, or did the Hittites adapt it to their own musical aesthetic? We can't know, but either possibility is fascinating. Mathematical and theoretical knowledge circulated widely. The Babylonians' sophisticated understanding of mathematics was known to other peoples. Their astronomical knowledge was prized and studied. Did their musical theory also circulate? Probably, given music's importance in temple ritual and the interconnection of mathematics and music. The concept of music as a theoretical subject, something that could be systematized and written about, appears to have originated in Mesopotamia and then spread. Later Greek music theory shows some striking parallels to Babylonian concepts, suggesting possible transmission, though the mechanisms and extent of this transmission remain debated by scholars. Theoretical innovations emerged gradually within this context of cultural exchange and local development. The Babylonians, inheriting Sumerian culture, developed systematic approaches to tuning. Texts from the Old Babylonian period describe tuning procedures for lyres, explaining which strings should be adjusted and by how much. These instructions use both musical terminology and numerical ratios, showing the connection between musical practice and mathematical thought. One text describes a process called tuning by fifths, where each string is tuned to a specific relationship with other strings. This is similar to Pythagorean tuning, which later Greek theorists would develop, suggesting the concept may have originated in Mesopotamia and traveled to Greece. The understanding that pitch relates to physical properties, string length, pipe length, tension, appears in Mesopotamian texts. The recognition that having a string's length raises the pitch by an octave represents a crucial intellectual achievement, connecting music to geometry and arithmetic. This insight allowed systematic experimentation and standardization. The concept of consonance and dissonance, which intervals sound pleasant together and which create tension, may have been understood at least intuitively. Although we have no direct textual evidence, the fact that Babylonian tuning texts describe some intervals as good and specify particular tunings suggests aesthetic judgments based on how intervals sounded together. Notation developed slowly and remained limited throughout the ancient period. The Ugarit tablet is remarkable precisely because musical notation is so rare. Most music was transmitted orally, learned by imitation and memorization. A young musician learned by watching and listening to older musicians, absorbing the tradition through years of patient practice. Why did notation develop so slowly, given that these cultures had writing for thousands of years? Several reasons suggest themselves. First, writing materials were expensive. Clay tablets or papyrus weren't casually wasted on representing something that could be taught orally. Second, ancient music, being primarily melodic and closely tied to text, didn't require complex notation. The text itself provided structure, and melodies could be memorized once learned. Third, notation may have seemed to violate the sacred character of music. Perhaps there was resistance to reducing divine music to written symbols. When notation did appear, it served primarily as a tuning guide or memory aid rather than a complete representation of a performance. The Ugarit hymn notation specifies which strings to pluck but doesn't indicate rhythm, dynamics, ornamentation, or many other performance details. A musician using this notation needed extensive training and performance practice. The notation merely reminded them of basic pitch sequences. The lack of comprehensive notation tells us something important. This music was fundamentally an oral tradition, a living practice passed from person to person, generation to generation. Each performance was unique, shaped by the occasion, the performer's inspiration, contextual factors, and audience response. The music existed not as fixed compositions but as flexible traditions, maintained through collective memory and creative reperformance. Let us examine specific works or categories of works that give us windows into ancient music, beginning with the most famous, the hymns of Enheduanna to the goddess Inanna. We have the texts of several of these hymns, preserved on clay tablets, copied and recopied across centuries. The most famous is the Exaltation of Inanna, a work of 153 lines in which Enheduanna addresses the goddess in language that is simultaneously formal and intensely personal. The hymn's structure is sophisticated, divided into several sections that build emotionally and thematically. It begins with cosmic praise, describing Inanna's power over heaven and earth. Lady of all powers, in whom light appears, radiant one, beloved of heaven and earth. The language is elevated, the imagery grand. Inanna is identified with the planet Venus, with storms, with the overwhelming power of sexual desire. But then the hymn becomes personal. Enheduanna describes her own situation. She has been driven from her position as high priestess, exiled by a political enemy named Lugalan. She's lost her temple, her authority, her home. The distress is palpable. He has turned that temple, whose charm was infinite, whose beauty was endless, into a house of lamentation. She pleads with Inanna to intervene, to restore her to her rightful position. The language here is direct, even demanding. How long will your holy heart be pained? I, your faithful woman, beseech you, that city which has acted against me, spread lies about me, may you turn it into dust. What's extraordinary is the emotional directness. This isn't generic praise, but specific petition. Enheduanna doesn't hide behind formulas, but speaks in her own voice, expressing genuine fear, anger, and desperation. The hymn documents a political crisis and a personal ordeal, using the framework of religious poetry to process trauma and seek divine intervention. The hymn's ending brings resolution, whether historical or literary is unclear. Inanna apparently intervened. Lugalan was defeated, and Enheduanna was restored. The final lines return to praise, but now the praise has been earned through the goddess's demonstrated power. The First Lady of the throne room has accepted Enheduanna's song. Inanna loves Enheduanna anew. It is good, it is good, it is good. The repetition, it is good, it is good, it is good, creates emphasis, relief, joy. After the poem's emotional intensity, this simple declaration provides cathartic release. We don't know the melody to which these words were sung, but the text itself has musical qualities. It uses repetition extensively, both of individual words and of syntactic structures. Lines often employ parallelism. That which has been created with you, let it be destroyed. That which has been given to you, let it be removed. This balanced structure suggests musical symmetry, similar ideas receiving similar melodic treatment. Certain phrases recur throughout the hymn like refrains and appeals to you, Hail Inanna. These recurring elements would likely receive recurring musical motifs, creating structure and unity across the hymn's length. The text includes some passages in the Emissal language, that special register used in religious contexts and associated with the gala singers. These passages may have been performed differently, perhaps by specific singers, or in a different vocal style, creating textural variety within the performance. The hymn was likely performed with harp accompaniment and possibly other instruments. We can imagine it sung in the temple of Inanna in Uruk in a grand ceremony to celebrate Enheduanna's restoration, or alternatively, performed annually as part of Inanna's regular worship. The performance would have been a ritual act, the music itself a form of magic intended to please the goddess and secure her favor. Scholars who have attempted to reconstruct possible melodies for Enheduanna's hymns face enormous challenges but have produced interesting results. Anne Kilmer, a pioneer in ancient Near Eastern music studies, created a reconstruction using the Ugarit notation as a guide. She posited a modal melody that moves primarily stepwise with occasional leaps, setting the text mostly syllabically, one note per syllable, though with some melismatic passages for emphasis. The reconstructed melody has a distinctive character pentatonic at its core, using 5 main notes, but with additional notes creating a 7-note scale. The mode isn't major or minor, but something else, creating an atmosphere that Western listeners might describe as exotic, ancient, mysterious. Whether this approximates what Enheduanna's hymn actually sounded like is unknowable, but it represents a serious scholarly attempt grounded in available evidence. Another of Enheduanna's works, the Hymn to Inanna, sometimes called Nin Sagura, follows a different structure. Rather than narrating a specific crisis, it systematically praises Inanna's various attributes and manifestations. The hymn is organized geographically, describing Inanna's presence and power in different cities across Mesopotamia. This geographical organization suggests the hymn may have been performed as part of a procession or a festival involving multiple cult sites. Perhaps different sections were sung at different locations, the hymn creating musical unity across physical space, binding together Inanna's various manifestations into a single totality. The poetic technique is dazzling. Enheduanna piles image upon image, epithet upon epithet, creating an overwhelming sense of the goddess's power. Destroyer of foreign lands, you confer strength on the storm. Beloved of Enlil, You have made awesome terror weigh upon the land. You stand at the service of An's commands. This accumulative technique suggests musical treatment that builds in intensity. Perhaps the melody rises gradually in pitch, perhaps the tempo accelerates, perhaps additional instruments enter, thickening the texture. The poetry itself suggests dynamic shape. A third work attributed to Enheduanna is the Hymn to Nanna, praising the moon god of in whose temple Enheduanna served as high priestess. This hymn is calmer than the Inanna hymns, befitting Nanna's character as a more stable, protective deity compared to the volatile Inanna. The moon god is praised for his light that illuminates darkness, for his cyclical journey across the sky, for his role as divine judge and wise counselor. The imagery is gentler, more pastoral. Nanna, great lord, light shining in the clear sky. When you lift your head, princes worship you. When you make your light shine, O great An, like a banner, the great gods stand in attendance on you. This hymn's different emotional character would presumably receive different musical treatment, slower tempos perhaps, more sustained tones, less rhythmic intensity. The match between textual content and musical style, while unverifiable, was almost certainly a conscious artistic choice. These hymns weren't Enheduanna's only works. Temple catalogs from later periods list additional compositions attributed to her, though the texts themselves haven't survived or haven't been definitively identified. She was a prolific creator, and what we have represents only a portion of her output. The survival of her work across such vast time copies made more than 500 years after her death speaks to its quality and cultural importance. Enheduanna achieved what few artists in any era achieve. Her works became classics, maintained and studied across centuries. Her name remembered and honored. In the entire ancient world, she may be the earliest author, not just composer, but author of any kind whose name and work survive together. Egyptian funerary music provides another window into ancient musical practice, though here we face even greater challenges in reconstruction, since we lack even fragmentary notation. Tombs depict funeral processions with musicians playing harps, flutes, and percussion. Female mourners are shown with their arms raised, mouths open, clearly singing or wailing. These images, found in tombs from the Old Kingdom through the late period, show remarkable consistency in basic elements despite evolving artistic styles. One famous scene from the tomb of Ramose, a vizier under Amenhotep III and Akhenaten around 1370, before the Common Era, shows mourners in great detail. Some beat their breasts, others tear their hair, some raise their hands to their heads in gestures of grief. Among them are musicians, a harpist playing a large floor harp, another figure playing what appears to be a double flute, and percussionists with hand drums. The positioning of musicians in these scenes is significant. They're interspersed among the mourners, not separated as a distinct group. This suggests their music was integral to the mourning process, not performance separate from it, but part of the collective expression of grief. Texts sometimes preserve the words of funerary songs, laments for the deceased. These texts follow conventional patterns but allow for individual variation. A typical lament addresses the deceased, describes the loss, expresses grief, and sometimes offers consolation by referencing the afterlife. One lament, recorded in multiple tombs with variations, includes these lines: "O you living upon earth, lovers of life and haters of death, as I was, so you are, as I am, so you shall be. Make the best of life, for life is so brief. Death comes to claim us all, no matter how powerful or wealthy. None can escape this fate." The philosophical tone is characteristic. Egyptian funerary texts balance grief with acceptance, sorrow with practical wisdom. This emotional complexity would require musical treatment that's similarly nuanced music that's sad but not despairing, serious but not morbid. One category of funerary songs particularly fascinating is the harpers' songs, named because they were sung to harp accompaniment. Many examples survive as tomb texts, usually inscribed near depictions of harpists performing at banquets. These songs have a somewhat surprising character for funerary contexts. While they acknowledge death's inevitability, they often counsel enjoyment of life. One famous harper's song from the tomb of King Intef includes these lines: "Follow your heart as long as you live, put myrrh upon your head, clothe yourself in fine linen, anoint yourself with the genuine marvels of God's giving, increase your well-being even more, and do not let your heart grow weary." This Carpe Diem theme sees the day appears repeatedly in harper's songs. The Egyptians, despite their elaborate preparations for the afterlife with pyramids, mummification, and burial goods, were also realistic about death's finality. The afterlife was hoped for but not certain. Better to enjoy life while you have it. Some scholars have seen these songs as expressing skepticism about traditional religious beliefs, even as they were inscribed in tombs decorated with religious scenes. Others argue they represent a different but equally valid Egyptian perspective: death makes life precious, so live fully. Musically, how might these songs have sounded? Harp was clearly central, the instrument specifically associated with this genre. The large floor harps depicted in tombs had 10 to 15 or more strings, allowing for substantial melodic range and possibly some simultaneous notes, creating simple harmonic effects, though this remains speculative. The harp's plucked, resonant sound would suit the contemplative character of these songs. Unlike the sharp attack of percussion or the sustained tones of wind instruments, the harp produces notes that bloom and then fade, each tone a small birth and death, perhaps symbolically appropriate for funerary contexts. The melody was probably modal, using scales similar to those we've discussed for Mesopotamian music. The tempo would be moderate, allowing the philosophical text to be delivered clearly, giving listeners time to absorb the meaning. Ornamentation was likely present but controlled, serving the text rather than overwhelming it. Performance contexts varied. Some harpers' songs were performed at actual funerals, part of the ceremonies accompanying burial. Others were performed at commemorative banquets held periodically to honor the deceased. Still others may have been performed at ordinary banquets, their presence reminding the living of life's transience and thereby intensifying present enjoyment, a memento mori enhancing rather than dampening celebration. One remarkable document, the Maxims of Ani, provides advice on proper behavior, including recommendations about music at funerals. It advises, "Make music at funerals, for it comforts the heart of those who mourn, but do not make excessive noise, for that is improper. The deceased deserves dignity, and those who mourn deserve respect." This suggests norms governing funerary music. It should be present, providing emotional catharsis and honoring the dead, but within bounds of propriety. Too much noise, too much display would be tasteless, violating the occasion's solemnity. Professional mourners, often women, were hired for elite funerals. These women specialized in lamentation, their wailing and singing performed for payment. This professionalization of grief may seem strange to modern sensibilities, but it served important functions. It ensured proper honor to the deceased. It allowed family members to mourn without having to organize the funeral's performative aspects, and it provided employment for women who might otherwise have few economic options. These professional mourners would have been skilled performers, able to produce convincing expressions of grief on demand. They knew the traditional laments, could improvise variations appropriate to specific deceased individuals, and could coordinate with musicians to create effective total performances. The tomb paintings show professional mourners in action: disheveled hair, torn clothing, dramatic gestures. Their singing would have been similarly theatrical, high-pitched wailing, sobbing between phrases, repetitive melodic figures expressing inconsolability. But not all funerary music was intensely mournful. Some seems to have been calmer, more meditative. Hymns to Osiris, god of the afterlife, were sung at funerals, asking him to welcome the deceased and grant them a favorable judgment in the afterlife. These hymns would have been more formal, less emotional, their music stately and measured. Modern attempts to reconstruct Egyptian funerary music have produced various results. Some recordings emphasize the mournful aspect, creating slow, melancholic melodies with prominent harp and plaintive flute. Others take inspiration from modern Egyptian funeral practices, which may preserve some ancient elements, though filtered through millennia of change. The most convincing reconstructions balance emotion with restraint, creating music that's sad but dignified, personal but also formal, acknowledging death without being overwhelmed by it, much like the texts themselves balance grief with philosophical acceptance. Work songs represent a third category of ancient music, harder to reconstruct because they were folk music, not typically written down or depicted in formal art, but texts refer to them, and logic suggests their character. Egyptian texts mention songs sung during grain harvesting, grape pressing, and flax processing. One papyrus, the Anastasia Papyrus No. 4, includes what appears to be a threshing song. Thresh for yourselves, thresh for yourselves, oxen, thresh for yourselves, thresh for yourselves. Straw for yourselves to eat, grain for your masters. Do not rest, for the day is cool. The repetition is obvious and functional, simple phrases that could be repeated endlessly, coordinating the oxen's circular movement as they trod the grain. The rhythm would match the animal's walking rhythm, steady and inexorable. Other work songs had call and response structures. One worker, usually the leader or overseer, would sing a line, and the group would respond with a refrain. This pattern appears in work songs worldwide and serves multiple functions. It coordinates group effort, it relieves the tedium of repetitive labor, it creates social bonding through synchronized vocalization. An Egyptian text describing construction work at a temple includes a reference to workers' songs. The laborers were singing as they worked, and the sound of their voices filled the air like the sound of birds at dawn. This poetic description tells us little about specific musical characteristics but confirms that singing during work was normal, expected, even valued as a sign of good morale. Mesopotamian texts also mention work songs. A Sumerian proverb states, "A sweet voice makes the work easier," acknowledging music's psychological benefits. Another text refers to songs sung by fishermen as they hauled nets, coordinating their pulling with rhythmic chanting. The characteristics of work songs worldwide are quite consistent, and ancient Near Eastern work songs likely shared these features. First, regular rhythm matching the work's rhythm, steady for sustained effort like hauling, faster and more varied for tasks requiring changing tempos like weaving or hammering. Second, repetitive structure allowing sustained singing without mental effort. Workers needed to focus on their tasks, not on remembering complex melodies or lyrics. Simple, repeated melodies with short, repeated texts served perfectly. Third, call and response patterns enabling group participation. Not everyone needed to know the whole song, just the refrain. A lead singer could improvise verses while everyone joined the chorus. Fourth, lyrics simple enough to remember and adapt spontaneously. Work song texts were often formulaic, with slots that could be filled with relevant details. Pull brothers, pull for the pharaoh could become pull brothers, pull for the temple, or pull brothers, pull for the vizier, depending on who employed them. The melodies were probably pentatonic or based on simple modes, using scales that were easy to sing and remember. Range would be limited, staying within an octave, comfortable for all voices. Leaps would be rare, melodies moving primarily stepwise, These simple musical characteristics shouldn't be mistaken for crudeness. Simplicity served a purpose, and within simple frameworks, considerable artistry was possible. A skilled work song leader could improvise clever verses, comment humorously on the situation, maintain group morale through musical creativity, all while keeping the basic structure simple enough for easy participation. The social function of work songs extended beyond mere coordination. They transformed labor from individual drudgery into collective experience. When workers sang together, they became a unified group, their voices and bodies synchronized. This wasn't just practical but magical in a sense, creating unity through sound, making the individual part of something larger. While Mesopotamia and Egypt developed their musical cultures in the Near East, music flourished in other parts of the world, following different paths but serving similar human needs. Examining these parallel developments provides perspective on what was universal in ancient music and what was culturally specific. In the Indus Valley, in what is now Pakistan and northwest India, a sophisticated civilization existed from 3300 to 1300, before the Common Era, contemporary with early Mesopotamia and Egypt. The Indus Valley civilization built planned cities with sophisticated drainage systems, engaged in long-distance trade, and created a still undeciphered writing system. Archaeological evidence for their music is limited, but tantalizing. Excavations have uncovered small terracotta figurines that appear to be dancers, their poses suggesting movement to music. Small clay whistles or flutes have been found at multiple sites, simple instruments capable of producing a few notes but definitely musical instruments. More intriguing are what appear to be drums depicted on seals. The Indus people used carved stone seals as marks of ownership or authority. Some seals show human figures in what might be ritual or dance poses, with objects that could be drums nearby. The interpretations are uncertain, but they suggest music was part of Indus culture. The Indus Valley people traded with Mesopotamia. Indus seals have been found at Mesopotamian sites, and Mesopotamian artifacts appear in Indus cities. This trade surely involved cultural exchange. Did musical instruments travel along these routes? Did merchants carry songs learned abroad back to their homelands? Probably, though documenting specific exchanges is impossible. After the Indus civilization's decline around 1300, before the Common Era, the Vedic period emerged in India. The Vedas, composed from around 1500 before the Common Era onward, preserve hymns that were sung, chanted, or recited in specific ways. While these post-date our main focus tonight, they represent another independent development of sacred music in ancient times. The Samaveda, one of the four Vedas, is specifically musical. Its name means song knowledge. Its hymns were intended to be sung using specific melodic formulas called samans. These formulas dictated melodic contours, though not with the precision of modern notation. Brahmin priests specialized in their performance, training for years to master the complex oral tradition. The Vedic chanting tradition continues to the present day, maintained across 35 centuries through rigorous oral transmission. While it surely has evolved over such vast time, it may preserve some ancient practices. The emphasis on exact pronunciation, on specific pitch contours, on rhythmic precision, these characteristics may reflect practices that extend back to the Vedic period itself, and possibly even to the Indus Valley civilization before it. In China, musical development occurred largely independently of Near Eastern influence, at least until much later periods. The Shang dynasty, from 1600 to 1046, before the Common Era, left us magnificent bronze bells, drums, and stone chimes. These instruments weren't merely functional but beautifully decorated, indicating their cultural importance. Chinese bronze bells, called zhong, were sophisticated instruments. Some were tuned to produce two different pitches depending on where they were struck. Sets of bells could be hung together, creating a musical instrument capable of playing melodies. The existence of such elaborate instruments implies organized musical performance, probably in religious and courtly contexts. Stone chimes, called qing, were made from precisely shaped pieces of stone, usually jade or limestone, suspended from frames and struck with mallets. Different sizes produced different pitches. Like bells, they could be arranged in sets to create melodic instruments. Archaeological excavations have uncovered complete sets, still capable of producing clear, resonant tones after 3,000 years. Chinese music theory developed its own sophisticated systems, based on principles different from those of Mesopotamia. The Chinese theorists posited a fundamental pitch called huangzong, the yellow bell, from which other pitches were derived using mathematical ratios. They developed a 12-tone system using a cycle of fifths, remarkably similar to later European theory but apparently independently conceived. The Chinese connected music to cosmology and ethics in ways both similar to and different from Near Eastern approaches. They believed proper music created harmony between heaven and earth, that incorrect music could upset the cosmic order. Each musical mode was associated with specific seasons, directions, and emotional states. A ruler had a responsibility to ensure proper music was performed, as this contributed to good governance and cosmic balance. This philosophical approach to music, while different in specifics from Near Eastern ideas, shares the belief that music has profound significance beyond mere entertainment, that it connects human activity to cosmic order, that getting it right matters for both practical and spiritual reasons. In Mesoamerica, civilizations like the Olmec, emerging around 1500 before the Common Era, developed their own musical traditions in complete isolation from Old World influence. Archaeological sites have yielded clay whistles, flutes, and drums. Some Olmec whistles produce eerily human-sounding cries, suggesting they were used for special effects in rituals. The Olmec, like the Mesopotamians and Egyptians, used music for religious ceremonies. Their religion, about which we know relatively little, involved ritual ball games, bloodletting ceremonies, and worship of jaguar-like deities. Music surely accompanied these activities, creating sacred atmosphere, coordinating ritual actions, invoking divine presence. Later Mesoamerican civilizations, the Maya, the Aztec, developed elaborate musical traditions documented in art, in surviving instruments, and in colonial-era writings. While these traditions developed after our period tonight, they remind us that musical sophistication emerged independently in multiple world regions, that the impulse to create organized sound, to use music for ritual and social purposes, is fundamentally human rather than culturally specific. Parallel developments in literature provide useful context for understanding ancient music, since in many cases, literature and music were inseparable. Poetry was meant to be sung or chanted, not silently read. The Epic of Gilgamesh from Mesopotamia, composed around 2000, before the Common Era in its standard version, though containing material from earlier periods, represents one of humanity's first great literary works. This epic poem narrates the adventures of Gilgamesh, king of Uruk, and his wild companion Enkidu, exploring themes of friendship, mortality, and the human condition. The epic's oral origins mean it may have been chanted or sung in performance, though we have no direct evidence of how this would have been done. The text itself has poetic features that suggest musicality, repeated epithets and phrases, balanced parallel structures, rhythmic patterns in the language. A skilled performer could have enhanced these features through vocal delivery, perhaps with minimal instrumental accompaniment. Certain sections of Gilgamesh seem particularly suited to musical treatment. The lament for Enkidu after his death has intense emotional content that would lend itself to mournful melodic setting. Descriptions of Gilgamesh's journeys could be rendered in more neutral narrative style. Dialogue between characters might be performed with different vocal characterizations. Whether Gilgamesh was actually performed musically is uncertain, but the text comes alive when read aloud or recited, suggesting it was composed for oral performance even if that performance wasn't strictly musical in our sense. Egyptian literature included love poetry that shows particularly clear musical qualities. Collections of love poems from the New Kingdom, around 1300 before the Common Era, use refrains, parallel structures, and rhythmic patterns strongly suggesting they were sung. One poem begins, "The voice of the turtle dove speaks out." It says, "Day breaks, which way are you going? Let up, little bird, are you scolding me? I found my lover on his bed, and my heart was sweet to excess." The speaker addresses a turtle dove whose call has awakened her, then reflects on her beloved. This poem, and others like it, have been grouped into cycles with recurring characters and situations, suggesting they may have been performed as song cycles, like Schubert's Winter Rise 2.5 millennia later, though of course with completely different musical styles. The poems include refrains. "My heart remembers your love" recurs across multiple poems. Such refrains strongly suggest musical treatment, with the recurring text receiving a recurring melodic motif, creating structural unity. Visual arts in both Mesopotamia and Egypt achieved extraordinary sophistication and provide valuable information about musical practices, even though they themselves aren't musical. Egyptian painting and relief sculpture follow strict conventions, figures shown in composite view, with head and legs in profile but torso frontal. Important persons shown larger than lesser persons, regardless of actual spatial relationships, registers organizing scenes into horizontal bands. Within these conventions, however, artists showed remarkable skill and expressiveness. Depictions of musicians are common and often detailed. Artists showed finger positions on instruments, suggested movement through blurred hands, depicted mouths open in song, showed facial expressions suggesting emotional involvement in performance. While these images can't tell us exactly how the music sounded, they tell us how music looked, which instruments were used, how many musicians performed together, what positions they adopted. One famous tomb painting from the tomb of Nukt shows 3 blind musicians, a harpist, a lutenist, and a double pipe player. Their eyes are closed or obscured, clearly indicating blindness. This painting tells us several things. Blind individuals could become professional musicians. Musical skill provided employment opportunities for disabled persons. And the Egyptians recognized that blindness need not prevent musical excellence. Indeed, the blind were sometimes thought to have special musical abilities, their hearing sharpened by loss of sight. Mesopotamian relief sculpture, particularly from the Assyrian period 900 to 600 before the Common Era, depicts motion and drama with great skill. Palace reliefs showing military campaigns include musicians accompanying armies. Lion hunt reliefs show the drama and violence of royal sport. These aren't musical subjects, but they demonstrate artistic capabilities that sculptors applied equally to musical scenes. Relief scenes from Assyrian palaces show victory celebrations with musicians. We see harps, lyres, double pipes, and drums. The sculptors rendered instruments in detail sufficient that modern scholars can identify types and sometimes even estimate sizes. The positioning of musicians in processions, in stationary groups, accompanying dancers tells us about performance contexts. Architecture provides another parallel and connection to music. The ziggurats of Mesopotamia and the pyramids of Egypt represent monumental achievements requiring sophisticated mathematical knowledge and organized labor. The ziggurat of built around 2100 before the Common Era, rose in 3 terraces to a height of about 30 meters. Its base measured roughly 60 by 40 meters. Constructing such a monument required extensive planning, coordination of thousands of workers, and careful supervision. Work songs must have accompanied this labor, coordinating effort, maintaining morale across months or years of construction. But architecture also created spaces for music. Temple interiors were designed acoustically, perhaps deliberately, perhaps coincidentally. Stone chambers with high ceilings create substantial reverberation, enriching sound, making a small group of singers sound larger and more impressive. Did ancient architects understand acoustic principles and apply them consciously? Or did they simply recognize that temples sounded good and build accordingly? Either way, architecture shaped musical experience. While Enheduanna is famous among specialists, countless other ancient musicians remain obscure despite their likely importance. Exploring what little we know about some of these figures helps us understand the broader musical world. An Assyrian text mentions a musician named Enheduanna, famous for his skill on the lyre. The text, a letter from one official to another, mentions that Enheduanna has been summoned to perform at a royal celebration. We know his name, his instrument, and that he was sufficiently renowned to be specially requested, but that's all we know. His entire life, all his music, his personality, his fate all lost except for this single mention. How many musicians like Enheduanna existed? People who were famous in their own time but whose names haven't survived even as fragments. Thousands, certainly. Every city would have had master musicians, people locally renowned for exceptional skill. Most left no trace in the historical record beyond, perhaps anonymous references to the singers or the harpists in administrative documents. Egyptian tomb inscriptions sometimes name musicians, giving us slightly more information. In the tomb of Rekhmir, a vizier under Pharaoh Thutmose III, 1479 to 1425, before the Common Era, musicians are listed by name and title. We find Amenhotep, singer of Amun, Senefer, harpist, Ta, chantress of Hathor. These names represent real individuals who lived full lives. Amenhotep, the singer, was born, grew up, received musical training, perhaps had a family, certainly had colleagues and friends, experienced successes and failures, grew old, if he was fortunate, and died. Yet all we know is his name and his professional title. Even this minimal information is more than we have for most ancient musicians. The tomb of the architect Ka and his wife Merit, discovered intact in 1906, contained numerous personal items giving us unusual insight into daily life. Though neither was a musician, the tomb contained a small harp among its contents, suggesting that playing music was part of domestic life for at least some elite families. Merit may have played this harp for personal enjoyment, not as a professional but as an educated woman with musical accomplishments. This reminds us that professional musicians weren't the only people making music. Amateurs existed, people who played or sang for pleasure, not livelihood. Unfortunately, amateur music making leaves even fewer traces than professional performance, so we know very little about it, but it surely happened. Parents sang to children, friends sang together at parties, individuals hummed to themselves as they worked around the house. The daily life of musicians in this era involved routines we can partially reconstruct. A temple musician in Babylon might wake before dawn to participate in the sunrise service. Temple gates opened at first light, and the morning hymn greeted the sun as the god's visible manifestation. The musician would wash, dress in appropriate temple garments, and join colleagues in the temple courtyard. After singing the morning hymns, perhaps 30 to 45 minutes of performance, there would be time for breakfast. Temple rations provided barley, dates, and beer. The musician might eat with colleagues, discussing the day's schedule, perhaps gossiping about temple politics or personal matters. Morning would bring various activities. Practice was essential, an hour or two spent maintaining vocal or instrumental technique. A singer might run through vocal exercises, work on difficult passages from upcoming ceremonies, practice new compositions. A harpist would tune the instrument, replace any broken strings, practice finger exercises and challenging pieces. Teaching consumed significant time for senior musicians. A master singer would work with younger singers, correcting their technique, teaching them proper pronunciation of archaic Sumerian texts, demonstrating how to ornament a melody effectively. This teaching was usually individual or in very small groups, allowing personalized instruction. Administrative tasks were inevitable. Instruments needed maintenance. Rosters for upcoming ceremonies had to be prepared. Disputes over rations or responsibilities required resolution. Music may have been the primary activity, but musicians were embedded in institutional structures with all their attendant bureaucracies. Midday brought the afternoon temple service, shorter than the morning service but still requiring musical participation, then perhaps more practice or teaching. Late afternoon might allow some personal time visiting friends, tending a small garden plot, playing with children if the musician had a family. Evening brought the sunset service, bidding farewell to the sun as it descended to the underworld, then dinner, socializing, and rest. The cycle would repeat tomorrow, varying only for special festivals that required extra rehearsals and performances. This routine, reconstructed from scattered evidence in comparison with other temple-based professions, suggests a life that was structured, secure, as long as one maintained one's position, and centered entirely on the temple's rhythms. It was a life of service, but also a life of purpose. The musician wasn't just earning a living, but fulfilling a sacred function, serving the gods through sound. Economic realities shaped musicians' lives profoundly. Temple rations provided basic sustenance, but they were often inadequate for comfort. Musicians supplemented their income through additional work, performing at private ceremonies, weddings, funerals, birthday celebrations for wealthy individuals provided extra income. Teaching was another income source. Wealthy families hired musicians to instruct their children. A daughter learning to play the harp demonstrated her family's cultural refinement. The instruction would be private, in the family's home, and well compensated. A skilled teacher could earn significant income this way, though it required time and energy beyond temple duties. Some musicians saved enough to purchase land, investing in agricultural property that generated rental income. A successful musician might become quite prosperous, though wealth brought its own complications: property disputes, tax obligations, jealous colleagues. At the opposite end of the economic spectrum, some musicians struggled. A musician who fell ill and couldn't perform might receive reduced rations. One who offended a superior might be punished with worse assignments or reduced compensation. The economic security wasn't absolute. It depended on maintaining one's position and one's health. Gender dynamics in musical life varied between cultures and periods, but generally offered women opportunities unusual in ancient societies. In Mesopotamia, both men and women served as musicians, though certain roles were gendered. The gala singers were a special case designated with symbols combining man and woman. They've been variously interpreted as eunuchs, as individuals occupying a third gender category, or as men who adopted feminine characteristics for ritual purposes. Female musicians are well attested in Mesopotamian sources. They appear in administrative documents, receiving rations alongside male colleagues. They're mentioned in literary texts. Archaeological evidence shows figurines of female musicians, yet details about their specific experiences, about how gender affected their professional lives, remain largely unknown. In Egypt, women's prominence in music seems to have been even greater, particularly during the New Kingdom, Women served as singers, harpists, lutanists, and percussionists. The sistrum, sacred to Hathor, was played almost exclusively by women, often priestesses. Female dancers performed alongside musicians, their movements integral to musical performances. Some elite women held titles like Chantress of Amun, which carried social prestige. Whether these were primarily honorific or represented actual professional roles is debated and may have varied case by case. Some chantresses probably sang regularly in temple services. Others may have participated only occasionally in major festivals. The tomb of Neferhotep, a scribe from the 19th dynasty, shows his wife Iwi playing a large harp. She's depicted seated, the harp taller than she is, her fingers on the strings. This wasn't symbolic, the detail suggests real observation of real performance. Iwi probably played this harp during her lifetime, and her husband ensured she was depicted doing so in their tomb, indicating that musical skill was valued and worth commemorating. Social class affected musical opportunities significantly. Elite families had their children educated in music as part of general cultural education. These children weren't being trained as professional musicians, but as refined individuals who could appreciate and potentially participate in musical culture. Professional musicians came from diverse backgrounds. Some were born into musical families and followed family tradition. Others showed talent and were recruited into temple service from ordinary backgrounds. Still others were enslaved war captives or debt slaves who became musicians through talent and training. A talented slave musician occupied an ambiguous position, legally unfree but potentially valued and even privileged. A slave who played beautifully for a wealthy household might enjoy comfortable living conditions, fine food, good treatment, yet they remained property, subject to sale, vulnerable to their owner's whims. Some slave musicians were eventually freed as rewards for faithful service, but many remained enslaved throughout their lives. How music was preserved and transmitted across generations reveals much about its social function and cultural meaning. Temple archives kept copies of hymns and liturgical music, but these were primarily textual, the words of hymns, instructions for rituals. The music itself was preserved in human memory, transmitted through the oral tradition of teaching and learning. Young musicians entering temple service spent years absorbing the repertoire. They listened to senior musicians perform, gradually memorizing melodies, rhythms, performance techniques. They practiced under supervision, their errors corrected, their successes praised. Eventually they could perform independently, and still later, they became teachers themselves, passing the tradition to another generation. This oral transmission meant music evolved gradually. Each generation made small changes, a variation here, a new ornament there. These changes usually weren't conscious innovations, but natural drift, the slight differences that inevitably creep into material transmitted orally. Over centuries, these small changes could accumulate, transforming the tradition significantly while maintaining continuity with the past. Sometimes, however, change was deliberate. A talented musician might compose a new hymn, which, if it proved popular and effective, would be adopted by colleagues and taught to students, entering the repertoire. Over time, the composer's name might be forgotten, and the hymn would be attributed to tradition or to the gods themselves, but the innovation would persist. Religious reforms could also change musical tradition. When a new dynasty took power, when political circumstances changed, when religious practices were reformed, all these could affect temple music. New hymns might be commissioned, old hymns associated with fallen regimes might be suppressed. Musical practice adapted to political realities. Training and apprenticeship systems were formalized in larger temples and court establishments. A child entering service at age 7 or 8 would begin with basic tasks, cleaning instruments, running errands, observing rehearsals. Gradually, they'd be given simple musical responsibilities, playing percussion in large ensembles, singing in choruses where their small voice would be supported by many others. As they matured and their voices changed for boys or settled for girls, they'd receive more specialized training. A youth showing aptitude for harp might be apprenticed specifically to a master harpist, learning through close observation and imitation. Singers would work on vocal technique, learn to read sacred texts if they were being trained for temple service, memorize extensive repertoires. The education was comprehensive, not just musical but religious and sometimes scholarly. A temple musician needed to understand ritual procedures, know the religious significance of different ceremonies, sometimes read and write. This education created well-rounded religious professionals, not merely technicians who could produce sounds. This training created professional identity and pride. Musicians saw themselves as part of a tradition, as links in a chain connecting them to mythical first musicians favored by the gods. In Mesopotamian mythology, certain gods were patrons of music. Enki, the god of wisdom, had musicians among his attendants. In Egypt, Hathor was the goddess of music itself. Musicians could see themselves as serving these divine patrons, their work sacred regardless of whether they played in temples or at secular celebrations. Family traditions in music were common and probably encouraged. A musician's child might follow the parent's occupation, beginning their education at home from earliest childhood. By the time they entered formal training, they already had foundational skills. They'd watched their parent practice, perhaps experimented with instruments, absorbed musical culture through daily exposure. Some families provided temple musicians across multiple generations, developing specialized knowledge and techniques passed down as family secrets. A family of harpists, for example, might develop particular tuning methods or ornamentation techniques that distinguished their playing and that they taught only to family members and carefully chosen apprentices. The emotional lives of these ancient musicians remain mostly hidden from us, but occasional texts offer precious glimpses. The letter mentioned earlier, where a musician complains about hand pain and delayed rations, shows frustration with working conditions, a very human response to professional difficulties. Another text, a fragment of a letter from the Babylonian period, shows a musician writing about missing their family. I have been in the king's service for 6 months now, traveling with the royal entourage. The work is prestigious, and the compensation is excellent, but I long to see my wife and children. Every night I think of them and wonder if my son has grown much in my absence. This musician was living the consequences of professional success, summoned to serve the king, well paid but separated from family. The emotional cost of professional achievement, a theme entirely familiar to modern people, was equally real 3.5 millennia ago. A third text, a fragment of a love song perhaps written by a musician for their own performance, or perhaps commissioned by a patron, includes these lines: "Your voice is sweeter than honey, your embrace softer than fine linen. When I hear you sing, my heart overflows with joy. When I see you play the harp, I am lost in admiration." This tender expression of love, using musical metaphors, might be entirely conventional. Love poetry often uses conventional language, but it might also reflect genuine feeling, a musician expressing real emotion through the only written medium available, poetic song. Either way, it reminds us that ancient musicians loved, desired, hoped, suffered the full range of human emotions, even though the historical record rarely preserves such personal information. How were these ancient musical pieces originally experienced? Understanding the context of performance is essential, because context shaped meaning in ways that modern recordings or concert performances can't capture. Temple music was experienced in specific architectural spaces designed, at least in part, for acoustic effect. The great temples of Mesopotamia and Egypt were cavernous, built of stone or mud brick, with high ceilings and often columned halls. Sound in such spaces behaves differently than in smaller rooms. A single voice chanting in a large temple chamber would produce substantial reverberation. The voice's sound would reflect off hard surfaces, stone floors, walls, columns, creating echoes that blend with the direct sound. The result would seem to fill the space, the reverberations suggesting divine presence, as if the gods themselves were responding to the worshipper's voice. Multiple voices singing together in such a space create complex acoustic effects. Individual voices merge into a collective sound. Small tuning discrepancies between singers create subtle beating patterns, a slight undulation in the combined tone. Reverberation smears individual notes slightly, creating a continuous wash of sound rather than discrete pitches with silence between them. Did ancient architects understand these acoustic principles and design for them consciously? Probably not with modern scientific understanding, but they surely recognized that some spaces sounded better than others. A temple that sounded impressive, where the gods' hymns seemed to fill the chamber with divine sound, would be considered properly designed. Architects learned through experience which proportions, which materials, which designs created satisfying acoustics. Performances often accompanied visual spectacle. Religious processions involved priests in elaborate robes, carrying cult statues or sacred symbols. Offerings of food, drink, and incense created sensory experiences beyond sound. The sight of flames, the smell of burning incense, the taste of sacrificial meat and beer distributed after ceremonies. The music wasn't isolated but part of a total sensory and ritual experience. When we try to imagine how a Mesopotamian hymn sounded, we must remember that original audiences weren't sitting quietly in concert halls but participating in complex rituals involving movement, visual display, scents, tastes, and sounds all working together to create sacred atmosphere. Timing and astronomical context mattered. Dawn hymns greeted the rising sun, their words and melodies presumably different from evening prayers that bid the sun farewell as it entered the underworld. The hymn's meaning came partly from its cosmic timing. Singing to the sun god at sunrise wasn't merely symbolic but participatory, helping the sun rise through musical support. Seasonal festivals had their specific songs, performed at the same time each year. The New Year festival in Mesopotamia involved multiple days of ceremonies, each with its own musical requirements. Performing the same hymns each year at the festival created continuity with the past, connection to the cosmic cycles, assurance that the universe continued in its proper order. Egyptian festivals followed the lunar and solar calendars, with major celebrations marking astronomical events: the Nile's flood, the heliacal rising of Sirius, solstices and equinoxes. Music for these festivals wasn't arbitrary but cosmologically significant, performed at moments when the boundary between human and divine realms was thin, when music could bridge the gap. Modern recordings, even the most sympathetic reconstructions, necessarily strip away this context. We hear the music in isolation, through speakers or headphones, in domestic spaces nothing like temples. We can appreciate the melodies, analyze the structures, admire the reconstruction scholarship, but we can't fully experience the music's original meaning. This limitation doesn't make modern reconstructions useless, but it requires humility. When we listen to a recording claiming to present ancient music, we're hearing one aspect, the melodic and rhythmic content, perhaps the instrumental timbres, but missing the context that gave the music much of its meaning and power. Performance practice, evolution over the 25 centuries we've surveyed, must have been considerable, though we can only glimpse it through comparing sources from different periods. Early Sumerian temple music, based on evidence from around 2600 before the Common Era, appears to have involved smaller ensembles. Depictions show individual musicians or small groups, References to temple musicians list relatively few individuals. This suggests that early performances, while certainly skillful, involved modest forces. By the Old Babylonian period, 2000 to 1550, before the Common Era, evidence suggests larger and more organized musical establishments. Temple inventories list more instruments. Administrative documents record more musicians. This expansion likely reflected both population growth and increased institutional wealth, allowing larger musical staffs. In the Neo-Babylonian period 626 to 539, before the Common Era, temple establishments had grown substantially. The great temples of Babylon employed dozens of musicians in various categories. Ceremonies required large ensembles capable of producing impressive volumes of sound. This evolution from small to large ensembles must have affected musical style, though we can't specify how. In Egypt, comparison between Old Kingdom 2700 to 2170, before the Common Era, and New Kingdom 1550 to 1070 before the Common Era, tomb paintings shows clear changes. Old Kingdom paintings typically show 1 to 3 musicians. The instruments are primarily harps and flutes, with simple percussion. New Kingdom paintings show larger ensembles, 5 to 8 musicians or even more. The instrumental variety is much greater. Elaborate multi-string harps, long-necked lutes, double reed instruments, frame drums, tambourines, clappers, sistra. The scenes themselves are more elaborate, showing dancers, clapping audiences, musicians in fancy costumes. This iconographic evolution likely reflects actual musical development. Egypt during the New Kingdom was wealthy, its empire extensive, its cultural production flourishing. Large musical ensembles, elaborate instruments, complex performances all became possible and desirable in this context of prosperity and power. Instruments themselves evolved technologically. Early harps were simple, a curved wooden frame with 6 to 8 gut strings. By the New Kingdom, Egyptian harps could have 20+ strings, allowing much greater melodic range and possibly some harmonic effects. The construction became more elaborate, with decorated sound boxes, careful engineering for better tone. Mesopotamian lyres similarly evolved. Early lyres were relatively small, portable instruments. Later versions became larger, with more strings, more decorative elaboration, better engineering. The famous bull-headed lyres from the royal tombs of Ur, around 2500 before the Common Era, represent sophisticated instruments, both musically and artistically. The introduction of new instruments expanded the available sonic palette. The long-necked lute's introduction to Egypt during the Hyksos period added a new timbre, a new range of possible sounds. Musicians could explore new combinations, create new textures, develop new styles suited to the new instrument's characteristics. Tuning and temperament, how the specific pitches within a scale are precisely adjusted, may have varied by region and period. The Babylonian tuning text suggests some standardization within Mesopotamia, but local practices likely differed. A temple musician in Ur might tune their lyre slightly differently than one in Nineveh, following local tradition or personal preference. These regional differences would create musical dialects, variations within the broader Mesopotamian musical language. Similarly, Egyptian tuning practices probably varied between temple centers. Thebes might have had slightly different standards than Memphis or Heliopolis. These differences would be subtle. We're not talking about completely different scale systems, but small variations in tuning that would be most noticeable to trained musicians. Ornamentation, the addition of decorative notes to a basic melody, was almost certainly important in ancient music, though we can only speculate about its specific character based on later practices that may preserve ancient traditions. Singers likely added melismas, stretching single syllables across multiple notes. A word like great in a hymn to a god might be sung not as a single note, but as a melodic flourish. Gray at, the sustained vowel carrying a rising and falling melody. This embellishment would emphasize important words, add beauty and complexity to the melodic line, and demonstrate the singer's technical skill. Trill's rapid alternation between two adjacent notes may have been used as ornaments. A sustained note might be enlivened by a trill, the slight wavering adding interest and preventing static-sounding long tones. Wind instruments particularly lend themselves to trills, the player rapidly lifting and replacing a finger over a tone hole. Grace notes, very brief notes leading into main melody notes, probably decorated melodic lines. Approaching a main note from above or below with a quick grace note adds elegance and prevents mechanical-sounding leaps. Harpists and lutanists could easily add such ornaments, their fingers plucking extra strings briefly before the main note. Vibrato, slight variation in pitch around a central tone, was probably used by singers, though we can't know how much or exactly how. Modern Middle Eastern singing traditions use vibrato sparingly compared to Western opera, where it's almost constant. Ancient practice may have resembled modern Middle Eastern approaches. Vibrato used selectively for expressive emphasis rather than as a constant element. Dynamic variation, changes in volume, must have been used expressively. A hymn might begin softly, a single voice entering alone, then gradually build as other voices join, reaching a climax of full volume, then subsiding to quiet for the ending. This dynamic shaping creates drama, prevents monotony, and expresses meaning through volume changes. Tempo flexibility, rubato, was probably employed, though subtly. A singer might slow slightly before an important word, giving it emphasis, then resume the original tempo. Or an instrumentalist might accelerate gradually through a passage, creating excitement, then suddenly drop back to the original tempo. These performance techniques, ornamentation, dynamics, tempo variation, weren't notated because notation didn't exist in sufficient detail. They were part of performance practice, learned through apprenticeship, absorbed through years of listening and performing. Each musician would develop their own approach to ornamentation within the style's general conventions. This means every performance was unique. The same hymn performed by the same musician on different occasions would differ in details of ornamentation, dynamics, emphasis. This variation kept the music alive, prevented it from becoming mechanical repetition. Even familiar pieces offered fresh experiences through performers' creative choices. Coordination among multiple performers in an ensemble without a conductor or score required sophisticated techniques. How did musicians stay together? One musician, usually the lead singer or a master instrumentalist, would function as informal leader. Others would watch and listen closely, following the leader's tempo and dynamics. In homophonic music, everyone playing essentially the same melody, this coordination was relatively straightforward. Each musician needed to match the leader while adding their own subtle variations. In call and response structures, coordination was built into the form. One musician or group would perform a phrase, creating a natural pause during which others could prepare their response. The responding group would enter together, following their own leader or cueing off each other. Percussion provided rhythmic grounding. A steady drum beat gave other musicians a reliable reference point. Even if the melodic instruments and voices added rhythmic variations and ornaments, the drum maintained the underlying pulse, keeping everyone together. Rehearsal, of course, was essential. Ensembles didn't simply gather and perform complex pieces without preparation. Temple musicians rehearsed regularly, practicing together to develop intuitive coordination. They learned each other's tendencies, who tended to rush, who dragged slightly, how to adjust and maintain unified performance despite individual variations. Eye contact and physical proximity helped coordination. Musicians positioned to see each other could use subtle visual cues, a nod, a breath, a slight movement to coordinate entrances and releases. Standing or sitting in close proximity made it easier to hear each other over one's own sound, essential for staying together. Breath phrasing for singers created natural coordination points. Everyone needed to breathe, and breaths naturally came at phrase ends. By breathing together, singers ensured they ended phrases together and began the next phrase in unison. This technique, still used by choral singers today, was probably discovered early and used universally. Improvisation played a significant role, particularly in instrumental interludes and ornamental variation. A harpist playing between verses of a hymn might improvise a short solo, creating a melody related to the hymn but spontaneously generated. The improvisation would be guided by modal and rhythmic conventions, staying within the piece's general style while demonstrating the player's creativity. This improvisatory element meant that written notation, had it been more developed, still wouldn't have captured complete performances. The notation would represent the basic framework, but much of the actual music, the ornaments, the dynamics, the improvisatory sections would be added in performance. Comparing ancient performance practice to later traditions that may preserve ancient elements offers insights, though we must be cautious about assuming continuity. Modern Middle Eastern musical traditions use maqamat melodic modes similar in concept to ancient modes. They feature extensive ornamentation, improvisation within modal frameworks, and rhythmic organization into repeated cycles. While we can't assume modern practices directly reflect ancient ones across 3,000 years, some fundamental approaches may persist. Human voices and ancient instrument types, harps, lutes, flutes, percussion, have inherent characteristics that lead to certain natural performance techniques. Traditions passed down orally generation after generation, even with gradual change, may preserve some ancient practices. Scholars who create reconstructions of ancient music often use ethnomusicological comparison as one guide among many. They combine archaeological evidence, textual sources, theoretical texts, iconographic evidence, and comparative study of traditional musics to create informed hypotheses about ancient performance practice. The results can never be certain, but they're scholarly, grounded in multiple types of evidence, worthy of serious consideration. The performance of ancient music was, finally, a human activity, skilled people making conscious choices to create beautiful, meaningful sound. When we listen to modern reconstructions, even knowing their inevitable speculation, we connect across millennia with those human performers, the temple singer in Ur, the harpist in Thebes, the work song leader coordinating laborers, the professional mourner wailing at a funeral. All made music as humans have always made it with skill, with feeling, with the desire to create something meaningful from organized sound. Part 5. As we come toward the end of this extended journey through the music of ancient Mesopotamia and Egypt, let's reflect on what we've discovered and what it means for our understanding of music, of history, and of human nature. We've encountered the first composer known by name, Enheduanna, a woman who lived 43 centuries ago but whose voice still speaks through her hymns. Her existence challenges assumptions about ancient women's limitations, about authorship and creativity in ancient civilizations, about the origins of composed music as distinct from anonymous folk traditions. Enheduanna wasn't just singing traditional songs. She was creating new works within traditional frameworks, balancing innovation with convention, personal expression with ritual function. This is what composers have always done, in every era, in every culture. Her hymns establish that this artistic practice, composition as conscious craft, extends back at least to 2300 before the Common Era and probably earlier. We've seen how music was integral to the first civilizations, serving gods and kings, accompanying work and worship, marking life's major transitions from birth through marriage to death, and the Egyptians hoped beyond. Music wasn't an optional luxury, but a fundamental element of how these societies functioned, how they related to their gods, how they organized collective labor, how they processed grief and celebrated joy. This essential role of music in civilization's foundations suggests that music isn't peripheral to human nature but central. The archaeological record shows that as soon as humans settled in cities, built temples, organized complex societies, they made music. They invested substantial resources in it, maintaining professional musicians, crafting elaborate instruments, composing sophisticated liturgies. Music mattered deeply to them as it matters to us. We've explored instruments that archaeological excavations have returned to light after millennia: magnificent lyres decorated with lapis lazuli and gold, simple bone flutes, great bronze cymbals, elaborate harps with 20 or more strings. These physical objects, which we can see and touch, or at least see in museums and photographs, connect us tangibly to ancient musicians. The same type of object that produces beautiful sound today produced beautiful sound 4,000 years ago. Modern instrument makers have created playable reconstructions of ancient instruments. When a reconstructed Sumerian lyre is plucked, it produces sound not recorded, not imagined, but actual sound waves propagating through air. This sound, while not identical to ancient performances, we can't know tuning, technique, exact construction details with certainty, nonetheless approximates what ancient ears heard. This connection across time through sound is profound and moving. We've considered how these instruments might have sounded, what melodies they played, what rhythms they marked. The fragmentary evidence, the Ugarit notation, Babylonian theoretical texts, Egyptian tomb paintings, the instruments themselves allows partial reconstruction. We can't achieve certainty, but we can make educated guesses grounded in multiple types of evidence. The modes and scales, likely built on 7-note patterns but with intervallic relationships different from modern major and minor, would have created musical atmospheres unfamiliar to Western ears but recognizable as coherent, organized musical systems. The rhythms, probably closely tied to poetic meter and to natural work rhythms, would have provided clear structures while allowing for expressive variation. We've met the musicians themselves, temple singers and royal harpists, anonymous performers whose names are mostly lost but whose labor sustained the musical traditions. We've imagined their daily lives, their training from childhood through apprenticeship to mastery, their place in society as religious functionaries and professional artists. These musicians were real people with real lives, experiencing the full range of human emotions and situations. They worried about money, complained about working conditions, loved and married and raised families, took pride in their skill, competed with colleagues, taught students, grew old if fortunate, and died, leaving their knowledge to the next generation. The fact that we know so little about them as individuals shouldn't obscure that they were individuals, each with a unique personality, life story, artistic approach. Enheduanna is the rare exception whose name and works survive together. The thousands of other ancient musicians deserve our recognition even though the historical record has effaced them. In the grand arc of music history that we'll trace over coming episodes, Mesopotamia and Egypt represent the foundation. Here, for the first time, music became something more than spontaneous singing or playing. It became an art, cultivated and refined through systematic training and theoretical reflection. It became a profession, with trained specialists who devoted their lives to musical excellence. It became a subject of theoretical thought, with systematic approaches to tuning, scale construction, and modal organization. These innovations, professional musicianship, compositional craft, theoretical systematization may seem obvious to us now, but they had to be invented. Someone was the first professional musician, earning their living purely through musical performance. Someone was the first to think systematically about how to tune instruments mathematically. Someone was the first to sign their musical composition, claiming it as individual creative work. These someones lived in ancient Mesopotamia and Egypt. We don't know their names except for Enheduanna, but their innovations shaped all subsequent musical development. Every professional musician today, whether performing classical music or jazz or rock, descends professionally from those ancient specialists. Every music theorist analyzing scales and intervals follows in the tradition of Babylonian scholars thinking systematically about musical organization. Later civilizations built upon this foundation, each adding their own innovations. The Greeks developed music theory further, connecting it explicitly to mathematics and philosophy, theorizing about music's ethical effects, creating systematic classifications of modes and rhythms. Their theoretical works, though the music itself is largely lost, influenced later European music profoundly. The Romans spread Greek musical ideas across their empire while adding their own practical innovations in military music, theatrical music, popular entertainment. Roman organ technology, using water-driven pumps to supply air to pipes, represented a significant technical achievement that would influence later organ building. Medieval Europeans inherited both classical theory transmitted through texts and Middle Eastern performance practices encountered through trade in the Crusades. They blended these elements with their own innovations, the development of polyphony, musical notation capable of capturing rhythm and pitch precisely, new forms like the mass and motet creating musical traditions that would evolve into Western classical music. But even as music evolved through these later developments, certain fundamentals established in the ancient Near East remained constant. The human voice as the primary instrument of musical expression, melody as the essential element of music that carries emotional and semantic content, rhythm as the organizing principle that gives music temporal structure, repetition and variation as structural devices that create unity while preventing monotony. These basics, established in Mesopotamia and Egypt, persist not just in Western classical music but in musical traditions worldwide. From Chinese traditional music to sub-Saharan African drumming, from Indian classical ragas to Latin American dance music, these fundamental principles appear. They appear because they grow from human nature itself, from how our voices and ears work, from how our brains process sound and time. Why does this ancient music still speak to us today? Or at least, why should we care about it? Several reasons suggest themselves, some intellectual, some emotional, some practical for understanding music more broadly. First, studying ancient music connects us to our ancestors and to the deep roots of musical tradition. The impulse to make music is fundamentally human, present in every culture we know, emerging early in every child's development. Archaeological evidence suggests music has been part of human culture for tens of thousands of years. Simple flutes made from bird bones date back 40,000 years. But with ancient Mesopotamia and Egypt, we move from prehistoric music that leaves only artifacts to historic music where we have written records, images, and documented cultural context. This allows much deeper understanding. We can know not just that they made music, but how they thought about it, what it meant to them, how it functioned in their society. Understanding ancient music helps us understand this universal human trait, this need to organize sound into meaningful patterns. Why do all human societies make music? What needs does it fulfill? How does it function in human cognition, emotion, and social organization? Ancient music, being the earliest we can study in detail, provides crucial evidence for addressing these fundamental questions. Second, ancient music reminds us of art's resilience and transcendence. Despite the passage of millennia, despite the collapse of civilizations, the loss of languages, the destruction of cities, fragments survive. A clay tablet bearing Enheduanna's hymn carefully copied by a student scribe 500 years after her death. A tomb painting showing musicians performing at a banquet, the colors still vivid after 35 centuries. An actual lyre pulled from the earth, its wood preserved by chance chemical conditions, still capable of producing sound. These survivals testify to art's power to outlast the circumstances of its creation. The Babylonian Empire fell, its cities crumbled, its language died as a living tongue. But the music? Fragments persist, and from those fragments, modern scholars and musicians can imagine, can attempt to resurrect, can connect across the chasm of time. This resilience should inspire humility and hope. Humility because it reminds us that our own civilization isn't permanent, that the works we create may survive only as fragments if they survive at all. Hope because it demonstrates that even fragments can be meaningful, that even incomplete transmission of cultural heritage preserves something valuable. Third, ancient music challenges our assumptions about progress and sophistication. Modern people easily assume that sophistication is modern, that ancient peoples were primitive in their capabilities, that artistic achievement has progressed linearly from simple origins to complex present. But Enheduanna's hymns aren't primitive. They're sophisticated literary and musical works displaying individual artistry within traditional forms. The Babylonian theoretical texts show mathematical thinking about music comparable to later Greek theory. The instruments discovered archaeologically demonstrate advanced craftsmanship and sophisticated understanding of acoustics. Ancient musicians weren't fumbling beginners but skilled professionals working in mature traditions. A temple musician in Babylon had trained rigorously for years, mastered a complex repertoire, developed refined technique. They were as accomplished within their tradition as a modern classical musician is within theirs. The traditions differ, but the level of achievement within each tradition can be comparably high. Recognizing this challenges progressive assumptions. Human intelligence, creativity, and skill aren't modern inventions. The biological humans who lived 4,000 years ago were the same species we are, with the same cognitive capacities. Given different cultural contexts, different technologies, different knowledge bases, they nonetheless achieved remarkable things, including sophisticated musical culture. Fourth, ancient music provides perspective on our own musical moment and helps us think critically about how technology and social organization shape musical practice. We live in a time of extraordinary musical diversity and technological capability. We can listen to music from any period or culture at any time through recordings. We can manipulate sound digitally with precision impossible in acoustic instruments. We can distribute music globally instantly via the internet. Ancient musicians could do none of this. Their music was tied to specific occasions, heard live or not at all. Each performance was unique, unrepeatable. You couldn't save a performance or replay it. You could only remember it, and memory is fallible and selective. Music was necessarily local, bound to the community that performed and heard it. These limitations shaped what music was and meant in ancient cultures. Music was communal. You made it together or heard it in company with others, never alone in isolation. Music was ephemeral once the sound died away. It existed only in memory until the next performance. Music was bounded. You heard the music of your culture and nearby cultures, not the music of the entire world. Understanding these ancient limitations helps us recognize how our technological capabilities have transformed music. Recordings have made music permanent and infinitely reproducible, changing its ontological status from performance to object. Electronic media have made music solitary. We can listen alone on headphones, making music consumption a private experience rather than necessarily communal. Globalization has made all the world's music theoretically accessible, creating both enormous opportunities and potential for cultural homogenization. Neither the ancient situation nor the modern is simply better or worse. They're different, each with advantages and limitations. Recognizing this helps us think critically about what we gain and lose through technological change, what aspects of musical experience we want to preserve even as technology transforms the possibilities. Fifth, ancient music reminds us that music has always served multiple functions simultaneously. For ancient peoples, the sacred and secular, the utilitarian and aesthetic, the magical and rational, all interpenetrated. A work song coordinated labor, utilitarian, while also creating social bonding, social function, and sometimes invoking divine help, religious function. A hymn pleased the gods, religious, while also demonstrating the temple's cultural sophistication, social prestige, and giving singers pleasure in skillful performance, aesthetic enjoyment. Modern Western culture tends to separate these functions, creating distinct categories: sacred music versus secular, entertainment versus work, art music versus functional music. These distinctions can be useful analytically, but they risk obscuring music's multifunctionality. Ancient music, existing before these modern distinctions solidified, reminds us that a single piece of music can serve multiple purposes simultaneously. This recognition can enrich how we think about music today, helping us appreciate the many different ways music functions in human life, not privileging one function, usually the aesthetic, over others. The fragmentary nature of our knowledge about ancient music should inspire intellectual humility and methodological caution. We can reconstruct possible melodies based on the Ugarit notation and theoretical texts, but we can't be certain our reconstructions sound like the original. We can list instruments from archaeological finds, but we can't recreate the actual sound of a temple ceremony with absolute accuracy. We must make peace with uncertainty, with the fact that much is lost beyond recovery. This doesn't make the study worthless. Fragmentary knowledge is still knowledge, and educated guesses grounded in evidence are valuable, but it requires honesty about the limitations of what we can know. This uncertainty also offers intellectual freedom. It invites imagination constrained by evidence but not entirely determined by it. When scholars and musicians create reconstructions of ancient music, they engage in a creative act, using evidence as a guide but necessarily supplementing it with intuition and imagination. The result isn't the ancient music itself that's gone forever, literally unreproducible, but something else. A contemporary meditation on ancient music, a modern response to ancient inspiration, a scholarly and artistic attempt to bridge the gap between past and present. This process of reconstruction, uncertain as it is, has value beyond the specific musical results. It demonstrates that engaging seriously with the past requires both rigorous scholarship and creative imagination. The scholar must master languages, archaeological evidence, comparative musicology, organology, the study of instruments. But having mastered all this, they must still make imaginative leaps, must try to enter an ancient mindset, must use empathy and intuition alongside analytical reason. The methodology of ancient music studies thus offers lessons applicable more broadly. Rigorous evidence-based research can coexist with imagination. Uncertainty doesn't preclude provisional conclusions. Fragments can be meaningful, even when incomplete. The past is both knowable and mysterious, yielding to investigation yet retaining irreducible alterity. The interdisciplinarity required for ancient music studies is another methodological strength. Understanding ancient music requires archaeology, philology, history, art history, organology, acoustics, ethnomusicology, and practical musical performance. No single scholar masters all these disciplines. Productive research requires collaboration across specialties. This interdisciplinary collaboration models how complex questions often require multiple perspectives and methodologies. The archaeologist who excavates an ancient lyre provides crucial physical evidence. The philologist who translates hymn texts provides the words that were sung. The art historian who analyzes tomb paintings provides visual evidence of performance practice. The organologist who reconstructs instruments provides playable tools for experimentation. The ethnomusicologist who studies traditional musics that may preserve ancient practices provides comparative context. The performing musician who attempts to realize ancient music in sound tests hypotheses and generates new questions. Only by combining all these perspectives can we approach understanding of ancient music. This collaborative, interdisciplinary work demonstrates that the most interesting questions often exceed any single disciplinary framework. The ethical dimensions of reconstructing ancient music also deserve reflection. When modern musicians create performances of ancient music, they're inevitably imposing their own aesthetics, their own cultural assumptions, their own musical training. An Egyptian hymn performed by a classically trained Western soprano will sound different from the same hymn performed by a singer trained in Middle Eastern vocal techniques. Neither performance is authentic in the sense of accurately reproducing ancient practice. We simply don't know enough to ensure that. But one might be closer to ancient practice in certain dimensions: vocal technique, ornamentation, emotional approach, even if neither can be fully authentic. This raises questions. Should performers attempt to minimize their own cultural influence, trying to enter as fully as possible into an ancient aesthetic? Or should they acknowledge that full authenticity is impossible and instead create performances that honor ancient sources while being honest about contemporary mediation? Different scholars and performers answer differently. Some aim for maximum historical authenticity, using only reconstructed ancient instruments, attempting to infer ancient performance techniques from every available source, trying to set aside modern musical habits. Others embrace contemporary mediation, using ancient music as inspiration for new creative work that makes no claim to authenticity but honestly acknowledges its contemporary perspective. Both approaches have value. The quest for historical authenticity, even if fully successful reconstruction is impossible, disciplines imagination with evidence and can generate insights. The creative reinterpretation approach can make ancient music accessible and meaningful to contemporary audiences while being honest about what it is. Contemporary music inspired by ancient sources, not the ancient music itself. Perhaps the ideal combines elements of both: rigorous research into ancient practices, serious attempts at authentic reconstruction, but also honest acknowledgement of uncertainty and contemporary mediation. Performers can strive for authenticity while recognizing they'll inevitably fall short, can respect ancient sources while bringing their own artistry to the performance. If this journey into ancient music has sparked your curiosity, multiple paths invite further exploration, from listening to recordings, to reading scholarly works, to visiting museums, to exploring the broader context of ancient cultures. Several albums feature reconstructions of ancient Near Eastern music. Sounds from the Past by Ensemble de Organografia includes pieces based on Mesopotamian and Egyptian sources, performed on reconstructed ancient instruments. The melodies are modal and haunting, very different from Western classical music but beautiful in their strangeness. Music of Ancient Sumer by Ensemble Psalentes offers interpretations of Sumerian hymns, including works attributed to Enheduanna. The singers use techniques inspired by later Middle Eastern traditions, creating performances that are speculative but evocative. For Egyptian music, Music of Ancient Egypt by Richard Dumbrell and Musicians of the Nile features reconstructions based on tomb paintings and archaeological evidence. The use of percussion and the rhythmic vitality make these pieces surprisingly accessible and engaging. Anne Kilmer's recordings of the Hurrian Hymn from Ugarit, while not Mesopotamian or Egyptian specifically, represent the most substantial ancient musical notation we have and give a sense of how ancient Near Eastern music might have sounded. Multiple recordings of this piece exist, each making slightly different interpretive choices, which is itself instructive, showing how the same ancient source can be realized in different ways. These recordings are available on various streaming services and through specialty classical music platforms. I'd encourage listening with an open mind, remembering that these are interpretations based on fragmentary evidence, not archaeological facts. The musicians creating them have made informed choices based on available evidence, but different choices would yield different results. If you prefer to explore through reading, several books offer accessible introductions. Music in Ancient Mesopotamia and Egypt by Theodore Berg provides scholarly but readable overview of what we know and how we know it. The Archaeology of Music in the Ancient Near East by Richard Dumbrell goes deeper, examining specific instruments and texts in detail, though it becomes quite technical. Joan Aruz's Art of the First Cities explores the broader cultural context of early Mesopotamian civilization, including music. The Oxford History of Ancient Egypt, edited by Ian Shaw, provides comprehensive background on Egyptian civilization with sections on music and culture. These broader contextual works help situate music within the full richness of ancient life. For those interested in the theoretical and philosophical dimensions, The Origins of Music, edited by Nils Wallen, contains essays examining music's emergence in human culture from archaeological, anthropological, evolutionary, and cognitive perspectives. It's fascinating to see music studied from multiple disciplinary angles, each contributing different insights. Museums offer another avenue for engagement with ancient music. The British Museum in London has an extensive collection of Mesopotamian artifacts, including musical instruments, cuneiform tablets with musical texts, and cylinder seals depicting musical scenes. The Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York has significant Egyptian holdings, including harps, tomb paintings showing musicians, and liturgical objects associated with music. The University of Pennsylvania Museum of Archaeology, which conducted the famous Ur excavations in the 1920s and 30s, has particularly important Mesopotamian materials, including instruments and documentation of their archaeological contexts. The Louvre in Paris has outstanding ancient Near Eastern collections, including musical artifacts. Many museums have created online resources letting you examine these artifacts in detail, zoom in on paintings, sometimes hear recordings of reconstructed instruments being played. The British Museum's website is particularly strong for Mesopotamian materials. The Met's Egyptian collection is extensively documented online. During this era when physical museum visits may be difficult, these online resources provide remarkable access. You might also explore modern music that draws inspiration from ancient traditions. Various contemporary composers have written works incorporating ancient scales, rhythms, or texts. Michael Levy, a modern composer and performer, has created albums inspired by ancient lyre music. While these are modern compositions rather than reconstructions, they represent one way ancient music continues to inspire contemporary creativity. The essential thing is to approach this music with curiosity and patience. It won't sound like Mozart or the Beatles or anything from the familiar Western classical or popular repertoire. It comes from a different world, reflects different aesthetics, serves different functions. But if you allow yourself to enter that world imaginatively, you may find unexpected beauty, profound connections to human experiences that transcend cultural and temporal boundaries. As you listen to these reconstructions and explorations, consider the people who first made these sounds. Picture a priestess in a Sumerian temple, singing to the goddess Inanna, her voice rising through the stone chamber, reverberating, seeming to fill the sacred space. Imagine a royal harpist in Pharaoh's court, fingers plucking strings to entertain the god-king, the music declaring the court's sophistication and power. Think of ordinary people singing as they work, their voices rising together in rhythm with their labor, transforming drudgery into collective experience. These were real people, as human as we are, using music to express devotion, to find meaning, to make their work bearable, to celebrate and mourn, to mark the passages of life from birth through maturity to death. Across 40 centuries, we can still connect with them through sound, through the fundamental human impulse to make music. Thank you for joining me on this first extended journey through the slumbering musicologist. We've traveled far tonight, back to the very dawn of musical civilization, to the temples of Ur and the tombs of Thebes, to a world where music was new yet already sophisticated, where the first composers signed their works, where professional musicians devoted their lives to serving gods and kings through sound. I hope this exploration has brought you some peace, some gentle occupation for your thoughts as you rest. The ancient world may seem distant, separated from us by vast gulfs of time and cultural change, but it's connected to us through an unbroken chain of musical tradition extending across 40 centuries and more. Every song we sing, every instrument we play, every concert we attend carries forward something that began in those river valleys thousands of years ago. The impulse to organize sound into meaningful patterns, to express emotion through melody and rhythm, to use music for sacred and secular purposes, to train specialists in musical excellence. All these began with the Sumerians, Akkadians, Babylonians, Assyrians, and Egyptians whose musical world we've explored tonight. Their music, in its original form, is lost. We can't recover it fully, can't hear exactly what they heard, but we can honor it through study, through attempted reconstruction, through recognition of what they achieved and what they passed down to us. We are their descendants, culturally if not always genetically, and their gift of organized musical culture is one we continue to receive and to transform and to pass forward to future generations. If this musical journey brought you peace, I'd be grateful if you'd subscribe to The Slumbering Musicologist. Each Friday brings a new episode exploring different corners of music history, all designed for rest and gentle learning. You'll find a playlist of all episodes perfect for extended rest. Let them play as you drift into sleep, one episode flowing into the next. If you'd like to share your thoughts about this exploration of ancient music, you're welcome to leave a comment. And a simple like helps others discover these quiet journeys through musical history. Next Friday, we'll remain in the ancient world, focusing more closely on those remarkable Sumerian hymns we touched on tonight. We'll explore Sumerian hymns, the world's oldest songs, delving deeper into the musical and religious traditions that produced humanity's first named composer, examining specific hymns in detail, considering how they were performed and what they meant to the people who created and heard them. Until then, I wish you peaceful rest. May your dreams be filled with ancient melodies, with the sound of harps and voices rising in temples long turned to dust, with the songs of workers coordinating their labor, with the laments of mourners honoring their dead. Remember that music is one of humanity's oldest gifts to itself, a way of making meaning through sound that connects us across all barriers of time, space, and culture. The music of ancient Mesopotamia and Egypt reminds us that this gift is ancient, that as long as humans have lived in cities, built temples, organized complex societies, they've made music. And they will continue to make music as long as humans exist, because the need to sing, to play, to create beauty from organized sound is as fundamentally human as language itself. Rest well.